need you. The principal can handle all that stuff." "No," said Trout. "Mrs. Madison doesn't have the power and she doesn't have the authority." "She's the principal." "Of what? An elementary school? Come on, Des, are you trying to tell me she has the goods to bring this whole place under control and keep everybody in line? Some of the people here aren't even from the school. They aren't parents or staff. They're survivors who came here because it's the town's emergency shelter. What do they care if a grade school principal gives them an order?" Des barked out a harsh laugh. "And you think they'll listen to me? Are you high or stupid? I'm only a small-town cop." Des looked at him, and her eyes were haunted. "And let's face it, Billy, cops didn't exactly save the day. There wasn't a lot of protecting and serving going on. Or have you forgotten that the entire Stebbins Police Department is dead?" Trout slapped his palm flat on the door 6 inches from her head. It was as loud as a pistol shot, and Des jerked backward. "Now you fucking well listen to me, Desdemona Abigail Fox," Trout growled. "I know you're hurting because of JT. I know what losing him means to you." "No, you don't." "The hell I don't. I lost a lot of friends, too. Everyone I worked with except Goat. All of my close friends except for you. And as for you, I know you a lot better than you ever gave me credit for. Maybe I know you better than JT did. Go ahead and punch me if that offends you, because—" She did punch him. It was very fast and very hard, and it felt like being shot in the chest. Trout staggered 4 paces back and then fell hard on his ass. He sat there, legs splayed, gulping for air like a trout on a riverbank. "God damn it, you crazy bitch!" he wheezed when he could finally speak. It wasn't the first time she'd ever punched him, but it was harder than he'd ever been hit by anyone in his life. Des loomed over him. "You don't talk about JT." Trout struggled up off the cold concrete. "I wasn't talking about JT," he roared. "I was talking about me and you. What do you want from me anyway?" she demanded, getting up in his face. He thought, fuck it, and got up in hers. "I want you to step up, Des. I need you to stop being Des Fox, the injured crazy person, and be Officer Des Fox, the cop. Yeah, okay, the rest of the Stebbins cops are dead, and that sucks. And yeah, you have no real authority left. Yeah, life sucks too, and everyone we know is dead. Yeah, and all of that. But I just came from a room full of terrified children. Children, Des. Hundreds of them. Children who are probably going to die unless we put on our big girl panties and take charge. And by we, I pretty much mean you. Hit me again if it'll make you feel better. Kick my ass and stomp me if that's what it takes. But then put your big girl panties on and go do what you know you have to do." For a long handful of silent seconds, Trout was absolutely positive that Des was going to pistol whip him. He could see the desire to do that in her eyes. Her lips compressed, and he heard the creak of her knuckles as her hands balled into fists. Then Des abruptly took a step back. The action looked like it hurt, like it physically tore her away from the moment. She glanced wildly around as if looking for a doorway that would open onto a different world. Maybe the world of 2 days ago, when everything made some kind of sense. Or a world where there was no Stebbins County, no Billy, no JT, no Lucifer 113, and no zombies. She exhaled a long, deep, ragged breath. "Fuck you, Billy." She said it in a whisper. "Yeah," he agreed. "Fuck me." Then Des nodded. Not to Trout, maybe to herself. A single, curt bob of her head. Without another word, Des turned and climbed the steps as heavily as if mounting the stairs to the guillotine. Trout watched her go. When he was alone, he leaned against the wall and he, too, exhaled. His chest really hurt. Oddly, his back felt a little better, as if falling had knocked something back into place. "Why, thank you, Billy Trout, for that crucial sanity check," he said aloud in a bad approximation of Dez's voice, then switched to his own. "Oh, you're quite welcome, Officer Psychopath. Anything for a friend." Then he pushed off the wall, rubbed his aching chest, and limped up the steps after her. Chapter 36. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. "We have Borden on 5. "Borden? Is that a first or last name?" asked Gavin. The producer spread his hands. "That's all he gave us. Coming to you now." Gavin took the call. "We have Borden from Bordentown. Thanks for calling in." "Yeah, okay. I listen to this show all the time, and you talk about a lot of really weird stuff, but I saw something tonight that's weirder than anything you ever talked about." The man had a thick Kentucky accent, and Gavin figured he was right out of one of those deep woods hollers. A good old boy's good old boy. "I'm all ears, Mr. Borden." "It ain't Mr., just Borden." "Fair enough." "Well, I'm a trucker." "Oh, you shock me."
"And I'm doing a run from Chicago straight through to Baltimore, and I pulled off the interstate to get me a cup of coffee, one of them Starbucks places."
"I've heard of them."
"And as I'm walking out, I see this car pull up. And who do you reckon I saw getting out of that car just as bold as you please?"
"I don't think I'd want to hazard a guess."
"It was Mr. Homer Gibbons."
"Wait, the serial killer?"
"The very same."
"Excuse me, Borden," said Gavin, "but it's my understanding that Homer Gibbons was executed at Rockview Prison 2 days ago."
"That's what I'm saying. They killed that boy deader'n dead, and there he was getting out of one of those little Nissan thingamabobs, the Cube, bare-chested, barefooted, bold as you damn please."
"Homer Gibbon?"
"Yes, sirree, Bob."
"Alive?"
"Well, sir, to be fair, he didn't look all that hot. I think they must have messed him up some when they killed him."
Gavin looked at the producer, who was laughing silently on the other side of the glass. Gavin grinned and gave him a thumbs up. "Tell me exactly what happened, Borden. This is absolutely fascinating." Chapter 37. In Stebbins County, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Lonnie Silk did not understand the hunger. He was too hurt, too tired, too sick to even think about food. And yet it was all he could think about. With every staggering step he took, the need for something to eat turned like a knife in his stomach. It was worse than any hunger he'd ever felt. It was so much bigger than the pain of his wounds, so much more important than the disease that he knew was at work in his blood and flesh. He was so hungry that he wanted to scream. Or maybe he had screamed. Lonnie couldn't quite remember. If he had, then the storm winds had blown it away. He sagged against a wooden post at the corner of a big rail fence that bordered a field of swaying corn. Corn. He looked at it. He'd eaten raw corn before. Everyone who grew up in farm country had tried it. Before he knew he was doing it, Lonnie climbed up onto the rail fence, leaned over, let himself fall into the mud on the other side. He landed hard, and pain flared in every damaged inch of him. It didn't matter. He was too hungry to let it matter. Lonnie tried to get up. Couldn't. So he crawled to the nearest stalk, grabbed it, pulled it down, tore the ear from the stalk, ripped the green leaves away, and bit savagely at the kernels. And immediately spit them out. He flung the corn away, disgusted by it. This isn't what his hunger wanted, needed, craved. Lonnie cried out in frustration, and this time he heard his voice. It was not an articulate cry. There were no words. Instead, it was just an expression of need, of hunger. Lonnie looked wildly around as if expecting to see plates of food right there, needing to see food. Drool ran from the corners of his mouth, and Lonnie dared not wipe it away. If he did, Then he'd see what was in that spittle. What white, wriggling things were there. Things that were also hungry. So hungry. He moaned again and wept at the sound of his own voice. Lonnie grabbed the slats of the fence and slowly, painfully pulled himself up. Then, holding onto the rail, he began walking again. He didn't know where. He had no specific destination. He wasn't even sure where home was anymore. Down this road? Or farther along the road he'd been on? He didn't know. Couldn't tell. Didn't really care. He went the way his weak legs could go, using the fence to stay upright. Following his moans, following his hunger, looking for something to eat. Chapter 38. Town of Stebbins, 1 mile inside the Q-zone. Sam Imura told Boxer to pull onto a side road, and the Boy Scouts climbed out of the vehicle. Moonshiner hefted out a big duffel bag, zipped it open, and began handing out heavy-duty protective garments. These were not the standard white hazmat suits, but were instead Saratoga hammer suits. They were permeable chemical warfare protective overgarments with composite filter fabric based on highly activated and hard carbon spheres fixed onto textile carrier fabrics. Sam had rolled into action on dozens of occasions wearing a hammer suit. They were tough but light enough to permit agile movement during unarmed and armed combat. "Hoods?" asked Shortstop. "Not unless we know we're heading into close combat," said Sam. "It's a serum transfer pathogen. No airborne components." "Shit," said Boxer.
"You don't want these fuckers to French kiss you, brother," said Moonshiner. "Be a lot more action than I've been getting lately."
They all laughed. Sam turned to them, and when they saw the look on his face, the laughter faded.
"What?"
asked Moonshiner.
"Let's understand something right from the jump,"
Sam said.
"The infected are designated hostiles, and we react and respond the way professional soldiers should while in combat. But these are people. We don't disrespect them. If we have to pull a trigger, then it's a mercy kill, not a booyah moment. Feel me?"
The others took a moment, then nodded. Moonshiner said,
"Sorry, boss."
"No," said Sam.
"It's cool. None of you have ever been in this kind of fight before. There are no rules except the ones we make, so let's make rules we can live with when we're done."
"Yeah, I'm down with that," agreed Moonshiner. Gypsy, however, cocked her head and appraised Sam. "Boss, you said that none of us have ever been in this kind of fight. Have you? I mean, I thought this was all new shit." Sam gave her a weary smile.
"The team I used to run with dealt with something a lot like this. Different pathogen, but similar effect."
"Zombies?"
"Close enough for government work," said Sam.
"What happened?" Sam adjusted the fittings on his hammer suit.
"Bad things."
They climbed back into their Hummer. No one spoke at all for nearly a mile. Shortstop finally broke the silence.
"Boss, they've got jammers running, right?"
"Yes."
"Nothing's getting through except one channel reserved for the guard."
"What about us?" Shortstop tapped the small earbud he wore.
"What about the team channel?"
Sam jerked a thumb over his shoulder.
"We have a booster in the back, tuned to provide a dedicated channel for this mission. Good news is that we'll have a clear signal. Bad news is that the effective range is about 1 mile.
"That kind of blows," said Moonshiner.
"Yes, it does,"
said Sam.
"So consider it an intimate conversation between friends."
"Makes me all tingly," muttered Gypsy. Then Boxer tapped the steering wheel to get their attention and pointed to something at the extreme range of the headlights.
"We got movement, boss."
Imura saw it. A pale shape, vague and indistinct, more than 100 yards away.
"Get off the road."
Boxer killed the lights and pulled off the road, climbing the verge into a field. A tractor sat, cold and quiet in the rain, and beside it was a huge flatbed piled high with harvested vegetables. The humid air was thick with the smell of onions and dirt. Gypsy leaned between the seatbacks and handed a pair of night vision goggles to Imora. He put them on and adjusted the settings, then opened the top hatch of the Humvee and leaned on the big machine gun to steady his line of sight. There were no streetlights this far into farm country, and the sky was utterly black. Then, as he turned on the night vision goggles, the landscape was transformed into 1,000 shades of sickly green and ghostly gray. Because of the new position of the Humvee, it took almost a full minute before the thing that Boxer saw came into sight.
Looks like a group of people. 3 of them. Just them. Don't see anyone else.
He didn't whisper because the sibilant S sounds carried, and instead he spoke quietly.
Civilians. 2 men and a kid.
Are they infected?
Asked Boxer. Sam slid back down into his seat, pulling the hatch closed.
Can't tell.
Moonshiner pulled on a second pair of goggles.
Let me go take a closer look.
Roger that. Gypsy, go with them.
They opened the doors and got out. The dome light of the Humvee had been disabled. Gypsy put on her night vision goggles, then drew small arms and began moving down toward the side of the road. It is impossible to move with total silence through ankle-deep mud. However, the sound of the rain masked most of the noise. Moving without haste hid the rest. Moonshiner was on point with Gypsy behind and to his right, mindful to keep him out of her line of fire.
The 3 figures were 100 yards away.
Both men were dressed in work clothes that were pasted to their bodies by rainwater. The child wore jeans but no shirt. No one carried an umbrella. No one seemed to give much of a damn about the cold rain.
"Uh-oh,"
said Gypsy very softly. An old slatted wooden fence ran along part of the road and angled up to create a property line with the next farm. Moonshiner angled that way, and he and Gypsy squatted down by the corner post. While Moonshiner kept his pistol aimed at the 3 figures, Gypsy tapped her earbud.
"You seeing this, Ronan?"
Ronan, Sam Imora, said,
"Rain's too heavy. What are you seeing?"
She told him.
"You want us to let them pass or take them down?"
Hold your position, he said. I'm coming out.
A few seconds later, the rest of the team converged on the corner post. The lead figure was the oldest, maybe 45, a tall man with a black beard.
"See any bites?"
asked Boxer.
"Negative,"
said Moonshiner.
We confront them to make sure,
said Shortstop.
See if they're responsive to verbal commands. Let's try it,
said Sam. He stood up and began walking slowly toward the road, his pistol down at his side. Shortstop followed in his wake. The others fanned out to cover the road from several points.
Come on,
thought Sam.
Happy ending here.
Sam stepped into plain view.
U.S. Army,
he announced in a clear voice.
We're here to help. However, I need you to stop right there. Raise your hands and allow us to check you for signs of infection.
At first, it seemed that the 3 figures would walk past him without taking note of him. But then Sam realized that with the heavy rain, they may not have heard him. He tried it again, repeating what he'd said.
Be cool now, he thought. Let's everyone be cool and be friends.
The bearded man peered at him for a moment, his eyes dark in a pale face. Then he smiled at Sam, showing big white bucked teeth. Only it wasn't a smile.
"Sir,"
said Sam with flagging optimism,
"I need you to—"
And those teeth parted as the lips curled back from them. With a howl of aching hunger, the man came rushing at Sam Imora, pale hands reaching, pale teeth snapping at the air. Behind him, the younger man and the boy immediately rushed after him. Chapter 39. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des tagged 6 adults to stay with the kids and stand watch and ordered everyone else down to the gymnasium. Not asked, ordered. Trout knew the 6 she picked, middle-aged farm owners, fathers and mothers, the kind of steady people that you could count on. Everyone went. Even Jerry, the dazed man who had been singing to the little girl. One of the women in the group held his hand, though Trout didn't recognize her. It was a comfort gesture, he supposed. Nothing even remotely romantic in it. Human contact. The stick-thin principal, Mrs. Madison, walked with Des, with Trout following behind. They were the 2 most powerful women left in Stebbins, and they were as different as 2 people could possibly get. Mrs. Madison was tiny, older, highly educated, very cultured and mannered, and the exact opposite of what Trout would consider a physical person. He couldn't even imagine her going to the bathroom. Des, on the other hand, was raw and powerful in a way that was entirely different from male power. She was never mannish, and could even be feminine, or so Trout remembered with an aching fondness, but she was neither delicate nor mannered. If anyone had the sheer lack of personal survival skills to suggest that Des was a member of a weaker sex, Trout knew that what was left of that sorry individual would regret the ill-chosen and archaic sentiment for what remained of his life. Des was a boozy redneck country girl who would be equally at home in a Mississippi trucker bar or a Kentucky holler. She exuded a feral power in exactly the same way the big hunting cats do. Quick to anger, glacially slow to forgive. And yet, Trout loved her and respected her even though at times he felt like they were from entirely different branches of the evolutionary tree. When everyone was downstairs, the group formed a loose circle around Des and Mrs. Madison. Trout did a quick head count. 182, plus the 2 upstairs. More women than men by a 2-to-1 ratio. Mrs. Madison took point and raised her hand for silence. Trout remembered her doing it the exact same way when she was his 4th-grade teacher. So, apparently, did most of the people here. An uneasy, expectant silence fell over the group. "Thank you," said the principal. "Officer Fox would like to say a few things. She and I have already discussed these matters, and we are of a mind. I believe that what she has to say and the things she will suggest are what's best for everyone concerned. Officer Fox?" Mrs. Madison stepped aside and turned to face Des, and Trout recognized it as a tactic used by speakers who are practiced at validating another speaker through their own visible attention. It worked, too, because Trout saw the focus of the entire crowd zero in on Des. He suppressed a smile, appreciating the way that was handled. Des, however, was no public speaker. She glared at the crowd with open suspicion and hostility, and Trout prayed she wasn't going to use more threats and bullying to get things done. She surprised him, however. "Okay, listen up," she said in a neutral tone. "Here's the situation as we know it. We finished our sweep of the building, and there's no one else left inside who has any bites or any sign of infection." The crowd nodded. They'd all been part of that search. Even so, it was good to hear it said. "We have to face some realities here," Des continued. "First, we have to stay inside the building. The National Guard made that clear, and I don't think they're going to cut us any slack. So, for all intents and purposes, we're stuck on an island in the middle of the ocean. The good news is that we have our own generator and enough fuel for 5 days. Because this is the town's emergency shelter, we have blankets, flashlights, batteries, first aid kits, water, and a lot of food. Enough for maybe a week with the number of people we have. When we get low, the guard says they'll drop more on the roof. So we're good for now, and this thing will all be over by then." "Over?" asked Jenny DeGroot, one of the teachers. That one word was heavy with meaning and implications. "You know what I mean, Jenny," said Des. "They'll get us out of here, and then we can all—" She paused, fishing for the way to say it. So we can all take care of what needs to be taken care of. Most of them said nothing and just looked at her. A few, the ones Trout thought were the steadiest among them, nodded. Grief was tomorrow's problem. Today's agenda was all about survival. Now, the first thing we really need to talk about, said Des, her mouth, eyes, and voice hardening, is rationing. We are going to share everything. I'm going to put a few people in charge of inventory, someone else will be in charge of allotment, and some others will take care of cooking and food prep. No one else touches any food unless it's on their plate. No one hoards anything. Not food, not anything. If the supplies do get low, then the kids eat first and we eat second. Does anyone have a problem with that? Trout scanned the crowd. If anyone had a problem with it, no one said so. He even thought he saw some relief on their faces, and Trout could understand that. A plan was evidence of structure, and structure was stability. It was something they could react to. Good, she said. Next is the generator. The town's power is out, so the generator is all we have. I don't want to use it any more than we have to. If we turn it off during the day, we can stretch it out for longer than a week if we have to. That means that we eat the stuff in the cafeteria freezers first. After that, it's Spam and canned beans, unless they drop us some McRib sandwiches. That got a few smiles. It was a dent, and Trout was relieved to see Des attempting humor. It meant that she was on sounder emotional ground herself. Now we come to the real issue, continued Des. Security. We need to secure this building. If the guard is wrong, and there are more of those things out there, then we need to make sure they don't get inside. Partly because we don't want to turn this place into a Denny's for dead motherfuckers. No one laughed at what was an intensely lame joke. Des colored a little, but plunged on. And if the guard think that our security has been compromised, then they're going to finish what they started. She cut an inquiring look at Trout, who mouthed the words, "Go for it." And there's more, said Des gravely. We all know that the military wants to sterilize all of Stebbins, which means wiping out everyone and everything. Right now, the only thing stopping them is the broadcasts Billy made. That and one other thing. They think Billy has some information that might help them fight this disease or whatever it is. The people turned to Trout, and many of them moved back from him like he was infected. Does he? Asked Mrs. Madison. No, said Trout, and he briefly explained about Volker, the flash drives, and Goat. As long as they think he has the stuff, we're probably safe, said Des. But there's also a chance they could kick down the doors and come in here to take it. A murmur of dismay rippled through the crowd. Wouldn't they leave us alone if they thought we didn't have it? Asked Jenny. Wasn't that the deal? We stay in here and they leave us alone? That was the deal, said Des. Sure, but right now I'm not feeling too filled with a spirit of trust and belief. One of the farmers asked, So what do we do? Looks like we're in deep cow shit no matter how this thing goes. Des nodded. We do the only thing we can do. We fortify this place and do whatever it takes to protect the children and everyone else in this building. It's as simple as that. That's all well and good, said Jenny. But nailing boards over the windows isn't going to stop those helicopters. I don't think they'll use the helicopters again. Why not? We can't fight them. No, Des agreed. But if they use heavy weapons, then they can't guarantee they won't kill Billy and destroy those flash drives. She shook her head. If they come in here, it's going to be with regular men and guns, and we can stop them. The farmer looked uncomfortable with that. I don't want to get into a firefight with our own troops. Neither do I, said Des. You think I'm nuts? I'm not saying we start a war, but we have to be ready to defend this building if they try something. I mean, what choice do we really have? No one had a good answer to that. Trout wanted to punch a wall because the situation was so frustrating and awkward. Nothing was a clear choice. Nothing really made sense to him. All trust in the system was gone. One of the parents cleared his throat.
Okay, so, how do we do that? Secure the place, I mean. Do we, barricade the doors and stuff?
Des managed an encouraging smile. "That's a start," she said. Chapter 40. Town of Stebbins, 1 mile inside the Q-zone. The 3 infected left the road and came splashing and slogging through the mud toward Sam Imura. Each of them ran differently. The boy's gait was erratic, like a stroke victim trying to run. The younger man barely shuffled along, his limbs stiff and awkward, but the older man ran with an almost normal gait, fast and with clear determination.
"Ah, shit,"
said Boxer's voice in Sam's earbud.
"Boss?"
asked Moonshiner.
"I got this,"
said Sam, and he could hear the sadness in his own voice. He raised his pistol and sighted along the black length of the Trinity sound suppressor. He slipped his finger inside the trigger guard and squeezed. A black dot appeared an inch above the right eyebrow of the bearded man, and his head snapped back. Sam used a .22 automatic. The bullet punched in through the front of the skull, but it lacked the force for a through and through. Instead, the lead bounced around inside the man's skull and destroyed the brain. The efficient mechanics of the infected man's gait were destroyed in a microsecond. His legs and arms stopped pumping, and instead they flopped uselessly, like a puppet whose strings had all been cut. He fell badly, landed on his face, and did not move. The younger man was 3 paces behind him, and only with the third of those running steps did he try to move around the obstacle. As if it took that long for whatever drove his brain to identify the obstruction and attempt a course correction. It was too little and too late, and his foot struck the dead man's outflung leg. The younger man pitched forward, hit hard, and slid 5 feet through the mud. Sam Imura ignored him for a moment and watched the boy. He was maybe 11 or 12, a good-looking kid in a hayseed kind of way. Probably would have been a farmer when he grew up. Probably liked sports and girls and his folks. Probably a pretty good kid. Sam shot him. The boy fell and stopped being anything. Not a boy, not a monster. He was meat that would cool in the relentless rain. Something ignited in Sam's chest. He'd been in firefights before with other kinds of infected. He'd had to pull the trigger on what the military shrinks called a mercy killing, and what his commanding officers filed away as a righteous shoot. However, Sam knew full well that when any sane person pulls a trigger on a child, even an infected one, there was no mercy in the action. And it was in no way righteous. It was an act that made him feel complicit in a process of deception and abuse that was as old as warfare. Once, when a fellow operative made a crude joke about such kills as collateral damage, Sam took him outside and attempted to beat some conscience into the son of a bitch. The lesson hadn't worked. It didn't change the asshole, and it hadn't made Sam feel any better, though it felt good at the time. His shrink had a field day with that. Now, standing in the rain and watching the boy fall, Sam thought about the pathogen, Lucifer 113, named for a fallen angel. He wondered how far he was falling, how far he had yet to fall. The third infected was struggling to his knees. Sam almost shot him. He didn't. It wasn't a matter of mercy, even now. He tapped his earbud. "Converge on me. I need a spit hood and flex cuffs." The man crawled like an arthritic toward Sam, and as he did so, he uttered a low, terrible moan. Was it hunger? Or was it something else? Sam thought he could hear desperation in that moan, like a person trapped in a burning building. The rest of the Boy Scouts swarmed in, coming at the infected man from 4 points. Moonshiner, the biggest of the team, swept the man's hands off the muddy ground, and as the young man collapsed, the big man dropped his knee onto his back. He caught the back of the dead man's neck and forced the pale face into the mud, keeping it there despite all of the struggling. Sam observed those struggles. There was no art to them, no plan. It was pure reaction. Gypsy pulled a spit hood over the man's head, and the others bound his wrists with plastic flux cuffs. "What do we do with him?" asked Gypsy. "Leave him here?"
"Pop him,"
suggested Moonshiner. "No," Boxer said quickly. "What if the doctors can do something for him?" Shortstop shook his head.
"Intel I read says that this disease is a one-way ticket. No one comes back."
"That's theory," insisted Boxer. "We don't know that. It's not like this thing's ever been field tested." Moonshiner made a dismissive sound.
"Kid, look at this fucker. He's cold. I'll bet his body temp is already down 5-6 degrees. Take his pulse if you want to. Check for pupillary dilation. Do whatever you need to do, but he's not sick, Boxer. He's dead."
But Boxer shook his head. "Seen a lot of dead, man, and he doesn't look dead to me."
"Okay, then. Deadish. Dead-like. Pick whatever word you want to use. Make something up. Point is, this stuff's already eaten his brain. What do you think the docs could do for him? Build him a cage with an exercise wheel?"
"It's not—" "No," said Sam, cutting him off.
"It's not fair, and it's not right, and it's damn well not normal. But it is what's happening. The assholes who invented this took the concept of death and broke it. Doesn't mean what it used to, and we have to accept that. No matter how it looks, this man is dead. He's also infected and dangerous."
"Okay," said Gypsy. "So what's the call?"
"We have a to-do list, and one item on it is to determine if all of the infected are at the same level of coordination, aggression, or mobile speed."
"We saw some variety right here," said Gypsy. "All 3 of these cats were different."
"Yeah,"
agreed Shortstop.
"But why?" "I'll take all theories," said Sam.
They thought about it as they watched the bound infected struggle.
"Damage," said Moonshiner after a few moments. "That could be some of it. Head trauma, joint damage, even other infected gnawing on their tendons."
"Jesus," breathed Boxer.
"It makes sense,"
insisted Moonshiner.
"They're all injured, right? So, think about any group of ordinary people who are injured in a battle or an explosion. You get all kinds of different mobility."
"Makes sense," agreed Gypsy. "These are all going to be walking wounded."
"That covers coordination," said Sam. "What about speed?"
Boxer said, "Maybe rigor mortis?" They looked at him. "Oh, come on," he said. "Think about it. If these things are really supposed to be dead, and only some of them are functioning because of those parasites, then wouldn't the rest of them do what pretty much all dead bodies do?" Gypsy glanced around. "How fast does rigor set in? 3 to 4 hours, something like that? Up to that point, the infected— Actually, can we call them zombies? Infected makes them seem like sick people."
"And what?"
asked Shortstop.
"Zombies is easier?"
She shrugged. "It's not as real." They all got that. Everyone nodded. "So, these zombies start stiffening up within a couple of hours, so that'll account for different rates of movement right there. Freshies move more like real people. Stiffies kind of stagger like we saw in the video feeds we watched." Shortstop nodded.
"Rigor hits maximum stiffness in something like 10, 12 hours, right? Makes me wonder if there are any zombies out there who can't move at all, or can't move worth a damn, standing there or maybe lying in a field somewhere because they can't move."
"Okay," said Boxer, playing devil's advocate. "But nobody's reported a bunch of human scarecrows. These things are walking."
"But not well,"
observed Shortstop.
General Zetter's report talked about a lot of the infected moving in a slow, shuffling manner. I think that's full rigor right there."
"What about when the rigor wears off?" asked Boxer.
"It does that, wears off."
"Sure, but in like 4-5 days after death," said Gypsy.
"Even so, how will they be able to move then? Will they get fast again?"
Sam said,
"We don't know. There hasn't been that much time yet. The first infection was early yesterday, so we're not even 1 full day into this thing."
The bounded infected continued to struggle.
"So," drawled Shortstop, "what do we do with Sparky here? Do we take him back so they can study him? Is that what they want?"
"No," said Sam.
"The guard can get as many samples as they want. We're on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary. And yes, I realize how that just sounded. Zombies and all."
Everyone grinned at him.
"Point is that if we go on the basis that there are zombies and that a combination of injuries and the onset of rigor will explain most of how they walk and act, then what we look for is something that doesn't fit that model. A mutation, maybe."
Why?
asked Moonshiner. "Because we're hoping this disease isn't as perfect as everyone thinks it is," said Sam. When the others looked blank, he explained. "A mutation, should one even exist, is more likely to tell the scientists something about the stability of Dr. Volker's variation of the Lucifer plague. If mutations are possible, and, better yet, reproducible, then that opens a door for introducing other mutations that could disrupt the function of the parasite."
Boxer said,
"Wow, I actually understood that."
They stood for a moment longer, all of them in a loose circle around the writhing dead man.
"Again,"
said Shortstop,
"what do we do with Sparky here? Strap him to the hood like a 6-point buck?"
"No," said Sam.
"We leave him."
"Like that?" asked Boxer, pointing to the cuffs and spit hood.
"It doesn't seem right."
Gypsy shrugged.
"It's not like he's suffering, man."
Moonshiner leaned close and whispered,
"He's dead, Jim."
Boxer shoved him away.
Yeah, very funny."
"Leave him," repeated Sam. Nobody moved, though. They glanced around, at the rain-swept road, at the body that lay struggling at their feet, and back the way they'd come.
"Boss,"
said Shortstop,
"if these 3 kept walking down the road, they'd have come right up to the checkpoint we passed."
"Uh-huh," agreed Sam.
3 of these fuckers against those 2 kids back there?
"Uh-huh."
"You think those kids would have stopped them?"
"What do you think?" Sam said, making it an open question. They looked down at the infected. The man continued to writhe and fight against the restraints. His jaws snapped at the material of the spit hood. Gypsy made a disgusted noise. Moonshiner's grunt was dismissive, but it was Shortstop who answered the question.
"Not a chance in hell, boss," he said. "Not one chance in hell."
Together, the Boy Scouts walked up the slope to the Humvee. The big Browning .50 caliber mounted on the roof looked ominous, waiting, hungry. Chapter 41. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. "Ground floor windows are a priority," said Des. "All of the windows are security glass," said Mrs. Madison, "with wire mesh in each pane."
"Won't stop a bullet,"
said a farmer. "So we block the windows," said Des. "Look, this school is built like a blockhouse. There aren't all that many windows anyway, not on the first floor." 22, said Mrs. Madison, and Trout felt like kicking her. 22, okay, conceded Des. "So we lock them and cover them with paper or cloth so no one can see in. Then we stack stuff in front of them, cans with marbles or pieces of metal, anything that will make a lot of noise if the window is forced. We'll post people in the halls, and if anyone hears those cans falling over, then they shout out and we all come running." Several people nodded, and Trout felt the first splinter of encouragement. "All of the classroom doors open out," said Jenny DeGroot. We can get benches from the gym or other stuff and put them in the halls. If we hear someone breaking in, we can wedge the benches crossways so the doors won't open out." "Great idea," said Des, jumping on it. And suddenly everyone was throwing ideas out. Some were poorly thought out, just things to say from people who needed to be part of a solution, any kind of solution. But there were some good ones, too. "There are tools and hammers and nails and all that stuff in the janitor's office," said one of the teachers. Someone cleared their throat loudly, and the crowd turned toward one of the farmers, a young man with old eyes. Trout fished for his name. Uriah Piper. Piper shook his head and said, "There's a better way to secure the doors." "Okay, Uriah," said Des. "What have you got?" "Well, first," he said, speaking in the slow way some farmers do, "we don't need every door to even open. Once we secure the windows, we can seal off a bunch of the rooms. We can set those noise-making cans you mentioned, but otherwise make sure those doors won't even open." "How?" "Easiest and fastest way would be to nail a piece of wood along the bottom of the door. Nail it, or better yet, screw it right into the floor and position it so that it also attaches to the wall right there at the bottom, and maybe again at the top. Or we could erect a brace at an angle to the floor and toe-nail it in, then nail another piece to the floor behind that. Take a battering ram to open a door like that, and even then it wouldn't be easy. You'd have to tear the whole door apart to get through, and I don't think even soldiers can do that without us knowing about it." "Are you a carpenter?" asked Clark, one of the teachers, his tone filled with skepticism. "No, sir. I'm a dairy farmer, as I believe you know." "Then how do you know that will work?" Piper gave him a small, cool half-smile. "You live in farm country, Mr. Clark. How do you not know that would work?" That coaxed a few chuckles from the crowd. Okay, you're right," interrupted Des, clapping Piper on the shoulder. "It'll work, and it conserves our supplies. Uriah, you're in charge of securing the doors and windows. Everyone else helps you. Set up work parties and get going." She glanced around, saw some nods, a few blank stares, and Clark's doubt-filled scowl. Des locked her eyes on him. "We're not going to have a problem, are we?" she asked. Trout wondered how long Clark could meet that uncompromising blue-eyed stare. As it turned out, the teacher lowered his eyes after maybe a full second. Trout was pleased that Des wasn't so small that she nodded to herself to acknowledge the victory. Clark wasn't a bad guy or an asshole. He was scared and confused, and defiance or resistance was probably the only way he knew to try and find solid ground or a scrap of personal power. Des apparently knew that, too. "Okay, then let's get started," said Des. "I want this all done an hour ago." The group started to break up, but then Jerry Dumfries, the man who had sung the fractured lullaby, grabbed Des's arm. Wait, hold on. Let's not go crazy here." Everyone paused, looking at him. His eyes were wide and wild, and Trout was sure the man was a very short step away from screaming. "Hold on for what, Jerry?" asked Des. "We're acting like this is all really happening," he said. "And it's not. It can't be. None of this is really happening. I mean, come on, people are going crazy and eating each other? That's not happening. That's not what's really going on." Mrs. Madison took a step toward him and, in a gentle voice, asked, "Well, Mr. Dumfries, what do you think is happening?" "It's something in the water," he said. "I mean, that's obvious, isn't it? It's happened before, like when they put LSD in the New York subways. They did that at the Chelsea Hotel, too. And in France back in the 1950s. The CIA did it in France. They put psychedelic mold in bread and freaked all those people. It was wait a minute, yes, in Pont Saint-Esprit. And remember what Jim Jones did at Jonestown with the Kool-Aid? That's what this really is. They're doing something to us. They're messing with our brain chemistry. This isn't really happening. It's something in the water. Maybe they seeded the clouds, and that's why it started happening when it started raining. Nobody's really killing each other. My wife didn't kill anyone, and my kids are fine. Tracy and Sophie are just fine, and don't you dare try and tell me different. They're fine, but they're probably freaking out too. We have to get out of here, not lock ourselves up. We have to get out and Des Fox spun him around and slapped him across the face. It was, after all, what you do with hysterical people. Trout had seen it 1,000 times in movies and on TV. You slap the crazy out of them and knock some sense into them with a big open-handed wallop across the chops. The sound was as loud as a gunshot. Jerry Dunphy's spun in nearly a full circle and caromed into Clark, who tried to catch him and failed. Jerry crashed to the floor, his face blossoming with a bright red handprint. Des loomed over him, hand raised for a second blow, her mouth starting to form words that Trout knew would be some variation of the "cowboy up" speech. But Jerry screamed. He scuttled away from her, tears breaking from his eyes, his mouth trembling as terrified sobs tore their way out of him. He crawled all the way to the wall and huddled there, hunched and cowering, arms raised against the next blow, against the next inevitable hurt. The moment ground to a halt. Everyone froze into a tableau that came close to breaking Trout's heart. Des was caught in a role for which she was totally ill-suited, that of a bully terrorizing a helpless person. The other people looked shocked, but there was guilt there, too. Everyone was complicit in this moment. If the slap had worked, and Trout doubted that it ever did outside of Hollywood or a bad novel, then they would have tacitly supported what Des did. Instead, they were bystanders to injury, and there was no way to step back onto the ledge. "I," began Des, but even that small a thing, a single tentative word, made Jerry flinch again. He buried his head under his arms and wept brokenly. Des turned right and left, as if looking for the doorway back to a minute ago. She spotted Trout. "Billy, Trout moved past her and knelt in front of Jerry, who instantly shied away. But Trout made very soft, very slow shushing sounds. He sat down on the floor next to Jerry, wrapped his arms around the man and pulled him close, rocking him the way the man had rocked the little girl. Trout fought to find the words of that old nursery rhyme, found some of it, sang it quietly, leaning over Jerry to comfort the man with the warmth of another body. "Come along," said Mrs. Madison in a hushed voice. "We have work to do." One by one, everyone left, until only Des lingered, looking wretched and guilty and confused. Trout met her eyes. He gave her as much of a smile as he could muster, then a small nod. He mouthed the words, "It's okay." Near to breaking herself, Des Fox backed away until she reached the far end of the gymnasium. Then she turned and fled. "Shh, it's okay, Jerry," Trout said to the sobbing man. "It's all going to be okay." He lied. Chapter 42. The Oval Office, the White House, Washington, D.C. Scott Blair had a hard time keeping himself from committing a federal crime. He wanted to punch the president in the mouth. No, he wanted to do more than that. He wanted to beat some sense into the man. "Mr. President," he said with as much control as he had left, "the intelligence we are getting from Captain Imura clearly contradicts the reports being filed by General Zetter. The situation in Stebbins is far from stable, and we have 10,000 additional troops inbound," said the president. "We have another 5 on standby. The NBAC field team has arrived, and they are making their assessment, and frankly, Scott, I think they are in a better position to assess this kind of threat than a formal special operator." "I couldn't disagree more strongly," insisted Blair. "Sam Imura is one of the most experienced people we have, with the exception of Captain Ledger, who is, unfortunately, out of country and out of reach." Captain Imura is retired from active field work, said Sylvia Ruddy. He's been out of the field, in fact, for years. So what? I'd still trust his judgment more than anyone else on the ground in Pennsylvania. That's not your call to make, said Ruddy. Blair stiffened. Mr. President, may I speak with you privately? The president scowled. All right, that's enough. I don't want you two throwing rocks. This isn't the time or place. Ruddy folded her arms and said nothing. Please, Mr. President, said Blair, not budging. 2 minutes. This is ridiculous, said Ruddy, but the president held up his hand. If you don't mind, Sylvia, said the president. She stared at him as if he had kicked her. Then she turned on her heel and stalked about, slamming the door behind her. The president sighed. That's going to cost me. Blair shifted to stand between the president and the closed door, forcing himself into the line of sight. The president sat back in his chair and gestured for him to speak. 2 minutes, Scott. Permission to speak candidly. You keep asking that. I keep needing to. They regarded each other. Then the president nodded. Go ahead. Blair leaned his fists on the edge of the desk. What the fuck are you doing? What? This isn't like you, said Blair, his voice low and even. This isn't even close to you. Yesterday you were in command. You were the voice of reason while all hell broke loose. Now you're fumbling at the edges of this thing. Wait, hear me out. You said I could speak my mind, and this may be the last chance I have. Don't worry, I'm not planning on firing you. Christ, who cares about that? How can you still think that this is about politics or anything but a crisis? Sammy Mora knows biohazardous threats better than anyone currently on U.S. soil. Anyone. He trained most of the people in the NBAC teams. He wrote their field response protocols. While Simeon Zetter was playing hide-and-seek with the Taliban, Imura was hunting and bagging world-class bioterrorists, and he did so for 4 different people who sat in the chair on which you are currently resting your ass. The president didn't respond, but his face grew steadily redder. Sam said that the checkpoints along the Q zone aren't adequate. There are a couple of thousand local and state police itching to be a part of this. I know that we pulled them because we didn't want to deal with the complications of jurisdiction, and we were afraid of how they'd react if they found out our ground forces had to terminate infected police officers inside Stebbins. That's yesterday's news, and it does not matter. What matters now is getting armed, trained men and women to reinforce that Q zone while there is still time. The National Guard reinforcements won't cross into Stebbins sooner than 2 hours. We can put 1,000 police officers on that line in 20 minutes. And we'd lose all control of the situation in terms of media, and that doesn't matter. The president shook his head. Scott, while I commend you on your passion, I simply do not agree that we are in danger of losing control of the situation. I've known Simeon Zetter too long and too well to doubt his word. So have I. And it's not his word that I doubt. It's his ability to properly assess this kind of situation. The president spread his hands. I'm not convinced, Scott. Sorry. Blair really wanted to hit him. He wanted to kill him. He took a breath and said, Will you at least do this much? I have a scientist in my office, a Dr. McCready. She's possibly the best virologist we have, and she wants to talk to you. She has some things to tell you about Lucifer that you don't know, and she would like you to open a dialogue with Dr. Price at Zabriskie Point. Who and where? I don't know that person. That, said Blair, is the point. Price is the man who knows more about the Lucifer Project than anyone. And Zabriskie Point? It's a bioweapons research laboratory in Death Valley. Since when do we have a lab there? We've always had one there. You knew about this, and I didn't? Blair offered a chilly smile. Yes, sir. It's my job to know about such places, just as it's my job to advise you when the national security is in genuine peril. The president's eyes were hooded as he considered that. Okay, Scott. Go fetch your mad scientist. Chapter 43. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Goat squeezed himself against the passenger door, long legs pulled up, arms wrapped around them, trying once again to hide behind his own limbs, once again failing to accomplish an impossible task. Beside him, Homer Gibbon steered the cube from lane to lane. Windshield wipers slapped back and forth. On the radio, Townes Van Zandt was singing about how he was waiting around to die. Homer had the volume so loud that it hurt Goat's head and made his eyes twitch. Homer sang along, knowing every word. When the song ended and a softer outlaw song by Willie Nelson started playing, Homer turned the volume down. Outside, the rain was so heavy that the wipers were doing almost nothing. Homer never slowed down, though. He cruised at a steady 70. Goat found himself praying for an accident. He was willing to take his chances in a head-on collision. He eyed the wheel, wondering if he dared grab it and spin them into the oncoming headlights. Maybe. As if he could read Goat's mind, Homer said, "Don't be thinking bad thoughts, son." Goat squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head. The killer beside him chuckled. They drove. Then Homer said, "Tell me about yourself, boy. What kind of reporter are you?" When Goat could trust that his voice wouldn't squeak, he said, I'm a cameraman."
"What? You ain't even a reporter?"
Homer's mouth hardened.
"The fuck?"
"No, I am a reporter, but I mostly do camera work and video editing and social media."
"Social media? What's that shit?"
"Twitter, Facebook, stuff like that." Homer grunted.
"What's that have to do with news?"
"Everything," said Goat. He realized that this was a chance to reinforce his usefulness. The internet is a lot more important than anything when it comes to getting the news out there. Most people get their news from the net.
"Yeah, I've seen Yahoo News, but that ain't that Twitter shit."
"No, but a lot of people take URLs, web address links, from sources like Yahoo News and other services, and they post them on Twitter and other social media platforms. Other people repost the links. Sometimes a news story only reaches a lot of people because of posts on social media. Everyone tweets these days, even the president."
"Tweets? Now ain't that masculine as all shit?"
Homer let loose a big horse laugh.
"That's hilarious. Look at me, Homer fucking Gibbon, public enemy #1, tweeting. That's funny as balls."
Goat shifted his position, still defensive but easing the stricture in his muscles. "It would get your story out," he said, "to the biggest number of people, millions all over the world." Homer shot him a look.
"For real?"
"Absolutely." Goat paused. "That's how we got this story out. Billy Trout sent me news feeds from town, and I posted them all over the net so they'd go—" He chopped off that last word, not daring to say it. But Homer reached over and jabbed him with a finger.
"They'd go what?"
There's an, expression that,
"Fucking say it, boy."
Goat took a breath and said it in a rush. "When social media is used to break a story and it spreads really fast, it's called going viral." It took Homer a moment to process that, and then he began laughing. He was laughing so hard that he drove right off the road and slammed into a tree. Chapter 44. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. When Jerry Dumfries could walk again, Trout took him back to the big classroom and turned him over to Mrs. Madison. The principal wrapped a blanket around Jerry's shoulders and led him away. Billy Trout looked at the children. Despite the sound of hammering and people shouting as they worked in teams to fortify the school, some of the kids were actually sleeping. It amazed him. As exhausted as he was absolutely certain that he could not fall asleep. Not now, and maybe never again. Too much possibility of things waiting for him in the dark shadows behind closed eyelids. There was still no word from Goat, and with every passing minute, Trout grew more convinced that it somehow meant that everyone in the school had slid from the frying pan directly into the fire. Just for the hell of it, he tried the satellite phone once more. Nothing. "Fuck," he said, then immediately apologized, though none of the kids seemed to have heard or reacted. He spent a few minutes wandering around, checking on the kids, tucking blankets more securely around them, studying their faces to fix them in his mind, pulling names out of the air for as many of them as he could. He saw one face, a black-haired, chubby little girl with a beautiful face who slept with her arms wrapped around a small pillow, holding it to her chest as if it was a trusted teddy bear. Trout realized that he knew this girl very well, but hadn't seen her in the crowd before. He'd been to her first birthday party, to her christening, to at least 5 barbecues at her aunt's house. Her name was Belle, and she was the only niece of Marcia Sloane, the woman who had handled phones and done research for regional satellite news. Marcia was a curvy, retro-goth woman, north of 40 but always possessed of a timeless sexual appeal that was a legend throughout Stebbins County. Fiercely intelligent, saucy, and the very best of company under any circumstances. That realization brought with it the memory of the last time he'd seen Marcia. It was yesterday afternoon while Trout was coming back to Stebbins after interviewing Dr. Volker. By then the outbreak had cut all the way across the town. His last image of Marcia was her pale, torn, snarling face as it vanished below the level of his car's hood while the explorer ground her into the mud. That had been the start of it for him, the point at which the wild story he had gotten from Dr. Volker became the irrefutable reality of Billy Trout's life. "I'm sorry," he murmured, uncertain whether he was saying it to the girl, for all she had lost, or to her aunt, for what he had done to her, or to everyone, for what they were enduring and what lay ahead. More deeply saddened than ever, Trout turned and drifted back into the hallway. He caught sight of Des and called out to her. She turned and began walking toward him. They met at the hall's midpoint, by a 4-H trophy case filled with photos of kids with their awards for Best Piglet, Biggest Sow, Largest Pumpkin, Brightest Future. Is Jerry okay?" she asked tentatively. "He was in bad shape to begin with, Des. I don't think this did him any extra harm." "You're a bad fucking liar, Billy." "With the very best intentions." Des considered him for a moment. "Guess you do. And I guess I don't burn up a lot of calories giving you credit for it." They looked at the trophies and listened to the hammering. Echoing down from the second floor, they heard Uriah Piper and the teacher, Clark, yelling at each other. "Billy?" "Yeah?" "What happens if we can't get in touch with Goat?" "We will." "No, what if we can't? What if something's happened to him? I mean, if the stuff on those flash drives is that important." "I don't think it matters," said Trout. "Why not?" "When I interviewed Dr. Volker yesterday, he seemed to be pretty sure that Lucifer 113 was unstoppable. If there was a cure, or even notes about a possible treatment on those drives, I'm pretty sure he'd have told me." "Then why'd he give them to you at all?" "So someone would have a record." She turned. "A record of what?" Trout didn't want to answer the question. "Of what, Billy?" He could see the ghost of his own reflection in the glass of the trophy case. "A record of how it all ended." "How what all ended?" she demanded. And then she got it. She grabbed his arm and squeezed it hard enough to hurt. "Jesus Christ! Are you saying that Volker thought this was going to spread? I mean, really spread? Like a pandemic and shit?" "That's what he was afraid of. He thought Homer Gibbon would go right into the ground, buried in a numbered grave behind the prison. Volker planned it that way. The parasites that drive the plague would consume him and then die off for lack of food. It would have ended right there. But when Homer's aunt claimed his body, that changed the dynamic. What should have been some kind of sick punishment for a serial killer became something that kicked open the door to an outbreak. Dez's eyes were as wide as saucers. Chapter 45. Route 653, Bordentown Starbucks. They had no names. Not anymore. There were names on cards and licenses and wallets and purses, but those things no longer related to the things that moved and milled inside the coffee shop. Even the faces no longer matched the pictures on the cards. On the driver's licenses and university IDs, none of the faces was missing flesh. None of the smiles showed broken teeth. None of the clothes were torn and splashed with blood. These figures weren't those people anymore. The feeding was done, the hungers shifting from the flesh at hand to the potential of fresher meat elsewhere. The parasitic urges that drove them lost interest when it could no longer detect the signs of life. Breath and rushing blood and a beating heart. Genetic manipulation had ensured this, built it into the organic imperatives that drove these things. Just as the brain chemistry and nerve conduction was repatterned to kill and infect, to feast quickly but not completely, to spread the disease. That was the only goal. That was everything. Though the body ached for food, the minimalized brain moaned in desperation for it, even though there was meat right there. But there was not enough intelligence left even for frustration at the collision of immediate need and driving force. They bumped into each other without rancor or argument. It happened. They lost balance, recovered, moved on, either toward another collision or toward the door. Eventually, it was all toward the door, toward the movement outside. Lights in the rain, the stink of gasoline fumes, and beneath that was the smell of living meat. One by one they collided with the heavy glass door, rebounded, hit it again until it opened, stepping into the teeth of the storm with their own teeth bared. Unaware of the stinging rain or the hands of wind that tried to push them back, they moved toward the parked cars, sniffed the air, found only trace scents, old scents, but nothing alive. They staggered on through the small parking lot, spreading out, some heading toward the line of red taillights, others toward the line of white oncoming lights. The first of them that stepped onto the highway was a man with a green apron and a matching billed cap. He had no fingers. They'd all been bitten off, some by Homer Gibbon, though this man had no idea who that was. He had no thought at all about Homer or anyone, anything, except the hunger. He stepped off the grassy verge and walked directly into the hazy, dark gap between two bright headlights of a UPS tractor trailer going 70 miles an hour. The impact smashed him into the air and hurled him 30 feet away. It exploded him. Parts of him were flung all the way over the truck. One arm struck the window of a blue Subaru hard enough to crack the glass. The rest of him was pulped beneath the semi's wheels as the UPS truck tried to brake. There was a moment when the truck seemed to defy gravity, to rise like a balloon as mass and momentum in the storm-slick road conjured bad magic in the night. The semi slewed sideways and the trailer hunched up and over it, snapping cables and tearing metal. The two cars behind it, the CNN van and the Walmart truck behind it, punched 1, 2, 3 into the twisting truck and into each other. The storm was too violent for that kind of road speed. Everyone knew it, and everyone drove that fast regardless.
The storm and the plague killed them for it. The air above the eastbound lane was filled with a scream of metal and the popping of safety glass, the hiss of tires that were finding no genuine purchase on the wet roads, and the whoomp crunch of vehicle hitting vehicle. 30 yards away, the same vehicular gavotte was imitated on the westbound lane as 3 of the infected walked into the traffic. Cars and trucks slammed each other into accordion shapes. Other vehicles tried to swerve, but there was nowhere to go in that kind of traffic. On another night, when there was no storm and no major crisis, the roads would have been far less crowded. There would have been no rubberneckers, no press, no emergency vehicles, no troop transports, and no cars filled with family and friends trying to get to their missing loved ones in Stebbins. Cars spun and danced, lifting from the asphalt as big trucks hit them. Airbags popped like firecrackers, seatbelts restrained, and they broke and they cut into flesh. The last of the bloody figures from Starbucks moved onto the highway and were crushed by the colliding cars. Then the symphony of impacts faded out, replaced by the blare of horns and the rising chorus of screams. For a short time, a precious short time, the infected were unable to attack, each of them defeated by the metal things they had tried to attack to get at the soft food within. The victims of Homer Gibbons' attacks were crippled and mangled, every last one of them. It would be nearly 6 minutes before the first ambulances arrived, filled with EMTs who would see hurt people in the wreckage. Badly hurt and yet somehow still alive, still moving. The EMTs would work shoulder to shoulder with ordinary civilians, survivors of the wrecks or people who had been able to stop their cars and rushed forward to help. The EMTs and the civilians would work like heroes to pull the mangled people from the wrecks, to triage them, to stabilize them, to save them. Driven by professional responsibility, they would do everything they could to preserve the lives of the suffering wounded. All of this happened less than 1 mile outside of the Stebbins Q Zone. Chapter 46. Checkpoint number 43, Stebbins County Line. Lonnie Silk saw the soldiers up ahead, and his heart lifted in his chest. They wore the same kind of combat hazmat suit he did, but theirs were intact, and they still had weapons. Both of the soldiers had their hoods off, though. Lonnie recognized them. The sergeant, anyway. Rodriguez. Lonnie couldn't remember his first name. The other guy was a stranger, some white kid. It was the best thing he could see. Someone he knew. More important, soldiers. People who could help him. Lonnie raised his hand, took as deep a breath as his aching lungs could manage, and called out to them. Except that's not what happened. It took Lonnie a few seconds to realize that what he thought he did and what he actually did were slanting downhill in different ways. It wasn't one hand that he raised. Both hands came up, not in a signaling gesture, not a wave at all. His hands came up and reached toward the 2 soldiers as if, even from this distance, he could touch them. No, not touch. Grab. Grab? Was that right? Lonnie struggled to understand it. His fingers splayed open and then clutched shut, as if trying to grab the image out of the air. Why? To do what? He could feel his lungs expand as he drew in the air for his yell, but the ache was gone. There was pain, but it was different. A totally new kind of discomfort that felt oddly distant. It was like feeling someone else's pain, though that was totally nuts, impossible. The most confusing thing for Lonnie was how his words sounded as they issued from his throat. They weren't words at all. He didn't hear his voice call Rodriguez's name.
He didn't hear words at all. The sound was so strange, so weird, so wrong. It was a long, sustained sound of complaint, of need, of, oh God, of hunger. He tried to stop that sound from coming out of him. He tried to pull down his reaching hands. He tried. Lonnie Silk tried. The infection within him did not allow his voice or his hands to obey. The soldiers stood there, looking the wrong way, looking past the sawhorse barrier to the road on the other side of the Q-zone, as if they needed to see that, as if that road was important. Idiots. Fucking dumbass idiots. Lonnie screamed at Rodriguez, but the scream was another moan. Deep and plaintive and filled with a different kind of pain than Lonnie felt. Not the pain of bites and torn flesh and damaged muscle. This was the ache of pure hunger. The winds and rain tried to tear the moan out of the air, and for a moment Lonnie thought that the soldiers wouldn't hear it. Then the white kid turned, stared, let his mouth drop open, and then he screamed. "Tito! Jesus Christ! Tito!" Tito Rodriguez, that was his name. He spun around, bringing his gun up. He stared too. He screamed too. They both fired. Lonnie Silk heard the first bullets burn through the air around him and then vanish into the storm. Then he felt his body, what had once been his body, shudder and tremble as something hit him in the chest, the stomach, the thigh. There was pain, but only of a kind so far away, so small, so meaningless. His mouth opened, and the moan was louder now, rising above the howl of the storm. Rodriguez and the white kid kept firing. "No!" cried Lonnie in a voice that had absolutely no volume. His cries were unwanted in that stolen throat. No one heard them at all, not the soldiers, not the infection, not the storm. But it was all Lonnie had. He had no control over his body as it lumbered through the mud and into the hail of bullets. The two soldiers were fucking idiots. They fired wildly, forgetting all of their training, all of the captain's warnings. They tried to bully him down with round after round to his body, wasting ammunition, wasting seconds as Lonnie closed from 15 feet to 10 to 5 to... Suddenly, Lonnie's left eye went dark, and as an after effect, he felt the thudding impact of the bullet that hit him. He thought that would be it. A headshot. That's what the captain told them all. Hit the infected in the head and they go down. Aim for the head. "Don't you get it, you stupid fucks?" he tried to scream. "I'm one of them. I'm infected. Aim for the fucking head. Please. Oh God, please, aim for the head. The head. Shoot the head. Shoot me in my head." Except that one of these assholes had aimed for his head, had hit his head, had blown out one of his goddamn eyes. And yet Lonnie watched his hands grab at the white kid, saw the kid's face come suddenly very close as the hands pulled and his own broken, bleeding head lunged forward, felt the tough, rubbery resistance of skin beneath his teeth. Jesus Christ! Skin between his teeth. Lonnie felt the skin compress, become taut, collapse, tear, rupture, and then the blood, the liquid heat of blood against his lips, on his cheeks, in his mouth. "Please, God, just fucking kill me!" And then he felt another impact, this time over his right eye. He felt it for all of one moment,
and then a vast, featureless black mouth opened in the world and Lonnie's silk fell into it. As he vanished into the darkness, he thought he heard Tito Rodriguez calling his name. But soon it wasn't his name anymore, and the darkness was everything. Chapter 47. Zabriskie Point Biological Evaluation and Production Station, Death Valley, California. Dr. Dick Price was the director of research applications for a facility buried deep in a billion-dollar laboratory. The lab was located in a place Price personally felt was the most aptly named spot on Earth, Death Valley. There was no way to get to his lab except by helicopter, and when the birds were out of the coop, he and his staff felt like they had been abandoned on the dark side of the moon. Team members had to go through 10 kinds of security screening, including incredibly thorough background checks and psychological evaluations that felt like personality rape. The few who passed those tests then had to put their names to a stack of waivers and non-disclosure agreements, and one frightening document which, for all intents and purposes, signed away their constitutional rights. Once someone arrived at Z Point, as it was familiarly known, the government owned them, body and, as Price saw it, soul. Everyone on the science team knew that the place was illegal as hell. Even the support staff, cooks, guards, cleaners, and janitors, suspected as much. A word to a journalist could bring the place down and likely have several members of Congress and the Department of Defense thrown into jail, but the wording of those documents would land the whistleblower in an adjoining cell. It was criminal, but necessary. At least as far as Price and his masters at the DoD were concerned. The international agreements and bans on certain kinds of biological warfare were nice in their way, but Price didn't believe for a moment that any of the signatory nations were truly abiding by those rules. It didn't make a lot of sense to do so, not as he saw it. There were terrorist groups who knew how to grow viruses, and plenty of nations, North Korea, Iran, and China sprang to mind, that were definitely cultivating the next generation of weaponized pathogens. The CIA had proof, but politics and the subtle chess game of brinksmanship kept that information below the surface. It was leverage in all kinds of discussions, and as long as the bad guys screwed around with their bugs and bombs, the State Department and the CIA had some dials they could turn. Blackmail was far more important and useful than public disclosure. On the other hand, knowing that your enemy was designing microscopic monsters was in itself a tacit mandate to do the same. Maybe not for attack. Not even Price thought that America was crazy enough to release the kind of bioweapon that teams like Z-Point developed. But in order to build a good shield, you have to be able to study the sword it needs to stop. That's what the people at Z-Point did. They made monsters in order to study them and, ideally, craft response protocols, sera, antitoxins, and other prophylactic measures. For these reasons and others, Dick Price believed that he was prepared for the conversation he was about to have with the President of the United States. He'd had 2 similar conversations with a previous president during a bioweapon attack at the Liberty Bell Center in Philadelphia more than a dozen years ago, and then when a group of domestic terrorists created weaponized and communicable versions of genetic diseases including Tay-Sachs and sickle cell. Those had been difficult conversations, especially the first one, since the sitting president of any given administration is never advised about the existence of Zabriskie Point or similar stations until he needed to know. Plausible deniability was such a useful thing. "We're just about ready," said his aide. Price sat at his desk with a large laptop open and the encryption conference software up and running. He adjusted his tie, sipped some water, took a calming breath, and nodded to the aide. The screen display changed from a placeholder of the presidential seal to the face of the commander-in-chief. 2 people sat on either side of the president, Scott Blair, the national security advisor, and a young and very intense-looking black woman Price knew by reputation only, Dr. Monica McCready, a rising superstar in the epidemiology world. A woman, he reminded himself,
who had been mentioned several times as perhaps a better fit for the directorship of Z-Point than he was. Shit, he thought. That's just swell. He could feel sweat beginning to form along his spine. "Dr. Price," said the president. "Yes, Mr. President. Despite the circumstances, it is a pleasure to meet you, even virtually." The president gave a tiny nod. There was a brief round of introductions, but it was done fast and without the usual courtesies. "Have you been brought up to speed on the situation developing in western Pennsylvania?" "I have, Mr. President." "Am I to understand that you are familiar with Lucifer 113? There was both frost and anger in the president's tone. "Yes, sir, very familiar." "In what way are you familiar?" Price paused. "Well, Mr. President, as you know, No, Dr. Price, I don't know. Until 20 minutes ago, I had never heard your name or the name of your facility. While I am aware of the requirements of security and confidentiality, I am distressed to learn that we are continuing work on a bioweapon of such devastating potential that one of my predecessors felt compelled to use an executive order to terminate all work on it. Are you aware of that order, Dr. Price?" Price said nothing, and against his will, his eyes flicked toward the National Security Advisor. "Mr. President, I—" began Price, but his words faltered. The president shook his head. "When this matter is resolved," he said coldly, "there will be a full investigation. Make no mistake. However, I think it's fair to say that heads will roll at a higher pay grade than yours." Blair looked at the fingers of his folded hands, and Price saw something flicker on his face. Was it irritation? Was it cynical humor? Whatever it was, flicked on and off his mouth in a microsecond, and the president did not see it. Price said, Thank you." "But hear me on this, Doctor," interrupted the president. "A new executive order is forthcoming, and that will be enforced. Failure to comply will be met with the harshest possible penalties." "I understand, sir." The president studied him for a long 2 count. "Do you, Dr. Price?" "I believe I do, Mr. President." "Then let's get down to it. Samples of the pathogen are being sent to you by military courier. Even though you already have the original pathogen there, we now know that Dr. Herman Volker used a modified version. Volker said as much to his CIA handler when he called to alert us about what he had done." "What about Dr. Volker? If the release of Lucifer was an accident, then surely he'd be eager to help us." "Herman Volker is dead," the president said flatly.
"What?"
gasped Price.
"Was he infected?"
"He hung himself."
"Oh, no. That's horrible."
"Dr. Price, let's not waste time weeping over a man responsible for the deaths of thousands of American citizens." Price straightened and cleared his face of expression.
"Of course not, sir. It's just that he could have helped us. Remodeling a weaponized pathogen is tricky work, and even though it can result in something as apparently unstoppable as Lucifer, there are often chinks in the armor, so to speak."
"What kind of chinks?"
"Intentional vulnerabilities left by the designers so that they are not as vulnerable to the pathogen as, say, their enemies. Or, in some cases, design flaws that can be exploited to create a counteragent or some prophylactic measure."
The president brightened. "Are you sure?"
"Sure. No, sir."
"What will make you sure?"
Price considered. "One of 2 things offer the best chance of that. The first will be an examination of the Lucifer 113 samples being sent to us. We'll learn a lot by comparing it to the most recent version of Lucifer that we have."
"That's going to take time, though," suggested the president.
"We can work pretty fast when—"
"Skip the sales pitch. What's the other chance?"
"Looking at Volker's research notes. Do we know where they are?"
"There are no records in his office at the prison where he worked. The hard drives have been completely wiped and degaussed."
"Everything?"
asked Price, aghast that any scientist would do that to his own work.
"He kept no backups?"
"He did," said the president. "All of his research was copied to a set of flash drives."
"Well, that's terrific."
"Which we do not have." Price had to bite back a curse.
"Is anything being done to obtain those drives?"
"Of course," said the president. "However, since we have no guarantee of that happening right away, we need to move forward with what we have. Is there anything you can tell me about Lucifer based on what you've so far been told about the current crisis?"
Price nodded. "I believe so, sir.
I reviewed some field reports from a doctor attached to the National Guard. If the reports are accurate, then there are marked differences between the current strain and the samples we were initially given here.
What differences?
Well, the rate of infection appears to have been greatly accelerated, possibly by a factor of 10. The original Lucifer samples we have been working with here have a much longer gestation period. This was a problem the Soviets recognized that essentially limited practical application of the weapon because there was too great a lag time between introduction and a full-blown outbreak. Now that appears to occur in minutes. That's rather exciting.
Doctor, warned the president, his voice low and slow. Be very careful in your choice of words.
I'm sorry, stammered Price. I meant from a scientific perspective.
I know what you meant.
The president's eyes were hostile.
So, Price noted, were those of Dr. McCready.
Price composed his own features to show contrition. Yes, sir, he said. My apologies. McCready bent close and whispered something to the president, who looked unhappy, but he nodded.
Doctor,
said the president to Price,
how active has your research been on the Lucifer pathogen?
You bitch, thought Price.
Aloud, he said,
We, have continued to study it in order to prepare a response protocol in the event of the weapon being deployed as, it currently has been.
What is the status on that research?
Price licked his lips. We have developed several advanced strains of the pathogen.
And where are you with response protocols?
Again, Price tried not to look at Scott Blair. We've made some progress. He leaned slightly on the word some.
Describe that progress, Doctor, ordered the president.
Sir, before I do, I need to explain what Lucifer is. It's more than just a weaponized disease. Lucifer was built using select combinations of disease pathogens and parasites. Those parasites have undergone extensive transgenic modification. Toxoplasma gondii is a key element, as is the larva of the green jewel wasp. The toxoplasma is a key element in artificially induced schizophrenia, a disease that heightens fear and increased psychological distress. This is the keystone of the uncontrollable aggression of the infected. Their brains have, to put it in layman's terms, been rewired to react as if they are constantly under attack. This triggers our most basic survival instincts, feeding each infected a modified cocktail of adrenaline, dopamine, and other elements. At the same time, the genetically modified lancet flukes Dicrocoelium dendriticum and Euhaplorchus californiensis combine to regulate that aggressive response behavior into a predictable pattern, specifically a pattern that includes seeking uninfected prey, attacking it, and infecting it. Remember, sir, this was developed by Soviet scientists during the Cold War as a self-cleaning weapon. Once introduced to, say, a base or station, the disease would spread like wildfire, and ultimately there would be no uninfected survivors. The infected would be unable to manage any organized defense, even to the point of being unable to aim and fire a gun. An armed infiltration team could then enter the base and eliminate the infected, and thereafter secure any physical assets like computers, equipment, and so on.
The president nodded. If there's more, Doctor, let's hear it.
The central element of the entire Lucifer program was the transgenically rebuilt green jewel wasp, a parasite that normally targets cockroaches. The wasp's venom blocks the neurotransmitter octopamine in the target, and from that point on, all movements of the host are controlled by the imperative biological needs of the wasp. Those needs are, of course, reproduction. With the combination of the toxoplasma, the wasp, and the flukes, the host has essentially become an organic robot whose sole operational software requires that it attack, bite, feed, and then seek other prey. The president looked sick, but his mouth was a hard, flat line.
About the feeding, he said, his voice thicker than it had been. Field reports indicate that the infected stop feeding on their victims after a while. Why don't they consume the entire body?
They can't and won't, said Price. That's a design requirement. If the infected lingered to consume their victims, there would be no new vectors, and it would stall the overall rate of infection. Mind you, they do need to feed, but only for the raw protein to feed the parasites as they spread throughout the bloodstream and infuse the mucous membranes. The hyper-accelerated life cycle of the parasites expends a great deal of energy. They need fresh protein to make more larvae so that every single drop of saliva is crammed with millions of eggs ready to hatch. But of equal importance to the infected is the need to spread the disease. That far outweighs their need to continue feeding. McCready spoke aloud for the first time. "If I may, Mr. President." "Dr. Price," she said, "what triggers the host to stop feeding on their victims? What's the biological off switch? We're hoping that there may be something there we can use as a prophylactic measure." Price shook his head in grudging approval of the question. "It's partly a reaction to nerve conduction, but it's mostly triggered by blood pressure. The normal intensity of blood pressure sparks aggression and appetite, but as it diminishes through injury and subsequent blood loss, it sends a signal to the parasite that the target is no longer a viable food source. That's the off switch, Dr. McCready, and God only knows how long it took the Soviets to crack that, especially with the crudity of genetics during the Cold War." "Doctor, when you're done congratulating madmen," the president said dryly, "perhaps you can tell us about what your team has developed as a countermeasure? Can we kill the parasites?" Price cleared his throat. "We, were never able to actually kill the parasites, Mr. President. Not the way you mean, not with a vaccine or anything of that nature. Not in an active vector. By the time the victim has become a host, the parasites have spread throughout his body. However, this corresponds to a dramatic drop in circulation. The host is very nearly dead in clinical terms, with minimal brain function, respiration, circulation, and nerve conduction in play. Just enough to allow it to continue acting as an aggressive vector. The Soviets did their work very well, however, and they designed it so that there was not enough circulation in play to transmit any kind of parasite-specific toxin throughout the host. Only destruction of the host stops it, and by that I mean either isolation long enough for the larvae to die off, say 5-6 weeks, or more practically, incineration of all infected tissues." The president closed his eyes for a moment. "Dear God," he murmured. However, McCready said, "Wait a minute, Doctor," she snapped. "You said that you were working on a countermeasure. Short of headshots, did you actually come up with anything?" "We, hedged Price. Then he took a breath and said it. "We found that the only possible or practical response was along the lines of fighting fire with fire." "Which means what?" growled the president. "We created a different parasite," he said. "One that is genetically designed to attack and consume the larva of the green jewel wasp. We're in the earliest stages of testing it, but I think it might work." The president suddenly looked at something off-screen, and Price heard someone that he couldn't see say something. Price couldn't hear most of the words, but he saw the way in which those words affected the president. Anger and concern were replaced by shock and then a twisted mask of what appeared to Price to be absolute horror. The same horror was mirrored on the faces of Blair and McCready. "Oh, my God," breathed McCready as she covered her mouth with her hands. Panic flared in the eyes of Scott Blair. The two words Price did hear hit him like punches to the face. Quarantine failed. If he heard more, his mind was momentarily unable to process it. Chapter 48. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des and Billy sat on opposite sides of a teacher's desk in an empty room. Des had swept all of the items from the desk and had covered it with rifles, handguns, and boxes of shells. "This is what we have," she said, "not counting the pieces I gave to Piper and a few of the others. 3 rifles with 50 rounds each, 2 shotguns but only 44 shells left, 3 Glocks and 9 magazines, all full, and this piece of shit 38. She nudged a Ruger LCR revolver. "I don't know why I even brought it, but there's a box of hollow points for it, so it's not entirely like giving a blowjob." Trout smiled thinly. "Didn't Sirhan kill Bobby Kennedy with a .22? What's your point?" "38's a bigger gun." "It's not the caliber that matters, Billy. It has a 5-round cylinder." She patted the Glock 22 Gen 4 holstered at her hip. "Extended magazine with 17 rounds. Which would you rather have if the shit comes down again?" "I can't hit a barn with a baseball, Des, so I'm not sure it would matter." Des leaned across the desk and pushed one of the shotguns toward him. It's Korean, but don't hold that against it. Daewoo USAS-12, gas-operated with selective fire. Very nice in close combat situations, which is pretty much the definition of life as we know it. I have a 10-round detachable box magazine or a 20-round drum magazine. Take your pick. Fires 12 gauge. He hefted it and winced. Shit, this thing is heavy. 13 pounds fully loaded, she said. Don't be a pussy. I have a bad back. Really? I thought maybe you had menstrual cramps. Does. She grinned at him, and it was the first time he'd seen an unguarded smile on her face in a long time. I'm just messing with you. He grinned back. Des picked up a pistol that didn't look like it could fire anything. There was no barrel. What's that, a taser? Close. Nova SP5, 5-shot stun gun. Bulky. Yeah, she agreed, and she affixed the holster to her belt. What's the point? I thought only headshots bring them down. Des snorted. How many human assholes have we dealt with so far? She asked. Much as I'd love to pop a cap in some of them, and the name General Zetter comes to mind, I don't think that would go over well. And you think tasing him would? They don't execute you for making a dickhead general piss his pants. Outside, the storm battered at the building. Des walked over to one of the windows and looked down at the parking lot. On one side of the lot, the National Guard had set up their camp, and there were all kinds of vehicles and portable structures down there, all of it turned gray by the rain. However, at the other end of the lot were big yellow school buses. Lots of them. Some from Stebbins and at least twice as many from surrounding regions. Buses that had brought the kids here to the emergency shelter. Trout joined her and looked out. Some of the buses had burned. Others were wrecks, torn apart by gunfire. The dead had attacked while the kids were being offloaded. Thousands had died, but there were fewer than 100 bodies. The rest had walked off. Trout wondered how many of them had been killed along with JT. They could clean out those buses, said Des. They could hose them out and put some heavy-grade clear plastic over the windows. To what end? To get us out of here. There are places they can take us, places where they could quarantine us, but where we'd all get better food and medical attention. Maybe they will, he said. Maybe in the morning. She just shook her head. He studied her profile, and then he saw her sudden frown. He followed her gaze and saw that something was happening down there. People were suddenly running everywhere. Soldiers scrambled to climb into troop transports, and beyond the fence, the big vanes of a dozen helicopters were beginning to turn. What is it? Are they coming for us? No, said Des. I think this is something else. As they watched, the soldiers dragged boxes toward the armored personnel carriers. It looks like they're leaving, said Trout. Why do you think? Because of the storm? Des shook her head. Maybe, Trout began. Maybe it's over. Maybe they've stopped this thing and they're standing down. Des turned to him and gave him a brief, harsh look. Does it look like anything's over, Billy? Is that what it looks like to you? Trout hesitated before answering. His statement had been on the stupid side of hopeful, and they both knew it. The troops below did not move like people whose long, dark night was over. There was none of the post-crisis malaise in anything they did. There was none of the laughter that comes at the end of great tension. Every movement down there was fast, but not everyone moved with the smooth and practiced ease of professional soldiers. They're definitely leaving. Yeah, agreed Des, and in a big damn hurry. Trout saw people collide into each other. He saw them drop things. He saw people running for transports only half-dressed. There was only one word that appropriately described what he and Des were seeing. Panic. Part 3. Collateral Damage. Pale death with impartial tread beats at the poor man's cottage and the palaces of kings. Horace, Odes. Chapter 49. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you're just joining us, folks, it has become a wild, wild night in western Pennsylvania. There are unconfirmed reports of military activity in the vicinity of Stebbins County. That is correct. You heard me when I said it. Military activity. So what does the Fink think about that? Well, we know that the National Guard is on call for flood control and disaster aid, and FEMA has also announced its presence. The President of the United States made a rather vague statement earlier in which he talked about natural disasters and cyber terrorism. Every word of that speech has already been dissected by the brain trusts on MSNBC and Fox, both of whom need a GPS and Sherpas to find a clue. Fox is talking about zombies. MSNBC is spouting some socialist claptrap about military helicopters firing at a school in order to stifle the live broadcasts of some whack job who claims to be reporting live from the apocalypse. And unfortunately, that whack job is a longtime friend of the show, Billy Trout of Regional Satellite News. We tried to contact Billy to get him to tell us his side of the story, or to find out what he's smoking, but it looks like Superstorm Zelda has knocked out more than the lights. There's no cell reception at all in or out of Stebbins County and large parts of Fayette County. Gavin paused to light a cigarette. So, again, you ask me, what does the Fink think? He laughed. For once, my friends, the old Gab has to admit that I don't have a clue. Not tonight. This one has me stumped. So, help Uncle Gavin out and call in and tell me what you think is happening on this dark and stormy night. Once more, all the call lights lit up. Gavin Fink took a long drag, blew smoke into the air, and took the next call. Chapter 50. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. How bad is it? The president fired the question off as he hurried into the Situation Room. It was the 10th time he had asked the question, but so far no one had been able to give him a definitive answer. Even now, each of the faces that looked up from the table gave mixed signals: doubt, anger, frustration, determination, and naked fear. Sir, said Scott Blair, as he came to intercept the president. Here's what we know. I was told there was an attack on one of our checkpoints. There was, said Blair. And we lost a soldier, but the other man on that post eliminated the infected and, resolved the resulting infection. It took the president a beat to understand what that meant. He blanched. Jesus Christ. The checkpoint has been reinforced and all checkpoints are on high alert, said Blair, but he was shaking his head as he said it. The problem, however, is elsewhere. A map of Stebbins County filled one window on the big plasma screen. A red dot glowed beside one of the major highways. There was an attack at a Starbucks on Route 653. How many casualties? It doesn't matter, said Blair. How the Christ can it not, sir? The victims of that attack were able to leave the Starbucks and they wandered into traffic. Their presence resulted in multi-car pileups, both directions. Blair pointed to a second screen, which showed an aerial view of a terrible traffic accident and what appeared to be a riot. Helicopter spotlights ranged over the crumpled wrecks of dozens of cars and trucks. Bodies lay in the road, some of them clearly crushed under or between the vehicles. The president walked numbly over to the screen to study the scene more closely. The pileups completely blocked the highway in both directions, and even spilled over into the Starbucks parking lot, which was positioned on a wide spot in the median. Behind the roadblocks, lines of cars stretched for miles in bumper-to-bumper traffic, headlights on, windshield wipers slashing back and forth, and everywhere, running between the cars, crawling over the wrecks, moving along the lines of stopped cars, filling the median, were people, fighting, struggling, rolling over and over in the mud or on the slick streets, punching and kicking, biting. The president tried to say something. His mouth worked, but there was no breath in his lungs, no air in the room, no words. General Zetter's voice croaked from the speakers. Mr. President, my God, Mr. President, permission to engage, permission to engage. He said it over and over again, as on the screen hundreds, no, thousands of people fought and screamed and died and came back to kill, to eat, to... Scott Blair touched the president's arm, lightly, almost gently, a gesture of pleading. "Mr. President," he said in a ragged whisper, "give the order." The president looked at him with eyes that were filled with so much confusion that it was clear the man teetered on the edge of collapse. "Mr. President, please." "Congress," muttered the president. "I need to inform them. I need approval for this. I can't. I can't. The nation—" "There isn't time, Mr. President. If we don't act now, there won't be a nation to save." The president's staring eyes blinked again, and then suddenly filled with a measure of understanding. "Do it," he whispered. It was the loudest sound in the room. Blair wheeled around. "General Zetter, the president has authorized you to go weapons hot. Engage the enemy with all resources."
"Acknowledged,"
said Zetter breathlessly.
"Going weapons hot."
The guns on the helicopters opened up, and instantly the screams of the dying were drowned out by the heavy growl of machine guns. The running figures began juddering and dancing as the rounds punched into them. Other helicopters, Apaches and Blackhawks, moved down out of the storm, flying awkwardly in the high winds. The pilots kept as much distance from each other as they could, but this was worst-case scenario for any pilot. High winds, heavy rain, enemies who looked like civilians, and no clear set of targets.
"Some of the pilots are not engaging,"
said one of the officers in the room.
"General Zetter,"
growled Blair, "half of your pilots have not engaged." There was the sound of arguing and shouting from the speakers, and they heard Zetter yell,
"There are no civilians, goddammit! This is a target-rich environment. Fire at will. Anything moving is designated an enemy combatant."
Even with that, some of the pilots repeated requests to verify those orders. Finally, the president himself had to yell into the mic, repeating the same words Zetter had used. Blair thought about how clinical and detached those words were. Target-rich environment. Enemy combatants. No civilians. Zetter was, finally, with the program, finally getting it right, but it was still so insanely wrong. On the screen, one by one, the helicopters began to fire on the crowds. General Armistead Burroughs growled,
"All pilots, you are cleared to deploy all weapons. Deploy all rockets, all missiles."
Once more there was a lag in obeying those orders. Once more the president had to repeat the orders. And once more the helicopters obeyed, one by one, slowly at first, and then with the kind of wild aggression Blair knew was only born from panic and despair. The helicopters rained fire down on the road. Rockets struck pockets of shambling dead and exploded like parodies of big-budget movie special effects. In the movies, though, people flew away from explosions, pulled by wires or digitally added as computer graphics. Here, the people burst apart in ragged pieces that lacked art or style. And though real explosions are always less dynamic than movie special effects, they were far more horrible in their understated destruction. Automobile gas tanks exploded one after the other, lifting the tail ends of Toyotas and Fords and Coopers and Hyundais with equal indifference and efficiency. Chain guns stitched endless lines of holes along pavements, through automobile skin and through flesh and bone. The living and the living dead crumpled under the cudgel blows of rapid-fire lead. The living died and stayed down. The dead, those with no traumatic damage to their brains or brainstems, rose again, less whole, less human-looking, but infinitely more monstrous. The living tried to hide from the dead and from the rain of fire. The dead were indifferent to it,
walking or running or crawling after the fresh meat, stopping only when the spark of life was blown from their central nervous systems. Blair and the president stood together, their eyes open and mouths slack, at the hell unfolding on the screen. Then Blair forced his mouth to speak. He turned to the Air Force general. "General Sisko, where are we with the fuel air bombs?" "We have 4 MQ-1C Gray Eagle drones fitted out and on deck. We can have them in the air and ETA," interrupted Blair. "What's the flight time?" Sisko didn't even pause. 22 minutes and change, and that includes lunchtime." "Shit." "And we have 4 A-10 Thunderbolt 2s from the 104th Fighter Squadron at the Warfield Air National Guard Base in Maryland. Fires are lit, and all they need is the word." Blair again touched the president. "Sir, we have to order them in now." The president's entire attention was locked on the screen. Blair wanted to punch him. He had never in his entire life wanted to beat anyone as badly or as brutally as he did this man. Before he even knew he was going to do it, he grabbed the president's sleeve, spun him around, and backhanded him across the mouth. Blair was not a big man, but there was so much rage, so much fear in every ounce of his body that the blow sent the president crashing sideways against the edge of the big table. Blood burst from torn lips. And a split second later, Blair was on the floor, his body exploding from sudden agony in his back and the after-impression of a Secret Service agent kidney-punching him. He was slammed to the carpet with a knee on his cheek and a pistol barrel screwed into his ear. Someone clicked cuffs onto his wrist, cinching them painfully tight. "No! No!" bellowed someone. And through the pain, Blair realized that it was the president's voice. From the corner of his eye, past the knee of the Secret Service agent kneeling on his face, Blair could see an agent and General Burroughs helping the president to his feet. Blood streamed down onto the president's chest, staining his white shirt, dripping onto his shoes. "Leave him alone, goddammit! Let him up! I am ordering you to uncuff him and let him up! Christ, someone get me a cloth!" The agents hauled Blair roughly to his feet and took the cuffs off. But they weren't gentle with either task. He stood there, legs weak and trembling, his right hand beginning to swell from where his knuckles clipped the president's cheek. The president gave him a look of savage intensity, but for the first time since the crisis began, there was that old spark in POTUS's eyes, that old fire, the fuck you blaze that had won him the primaries and enabled him to bully his way through brutal debates and a nail-biter of an election. The fires that had allowed this man to play hardball with Iran and North Korea, to refuse to be bent over a barrel by the Chinese. This was his president. The president pointed a finger at General Sisko. "Scramble the jets. Launch the drones. Stop this!" The general began shouting orders into a phone. Blair sagged with relief and fatigue. But then the president grabbed a fistful of his necktie and pulled Blair so close they were breathing the same air. Secret Service men closed in on both sides, but the president growled them back. He tightened his hold on Blair and, in the coldest, most dangerous voice Blair had ever heard the president use, said, "Call Sammy Mura and tell him to get me those flash drives. Now!" Chapter 51. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. "This does not look good," said Trout. Beside him, Des simply shook her head. They stared out the window, stunned, mystified, and deeply frightened by what they saw. The soldiers were scrambling to get into their gear and climb into vehicles. The roads leading away from the school were choked with Humvees and Strikers and an assortment of smaller and lighter armored vehicles. Then one of the big 8-wheeled M1135 Stryker nuclear, biological, chemical reconnaissance vehicles rumbled through the gates, the decks crowded with armed men in hazmat suits. Its 15-ton mass made the windows rattle. "Damn, it looks like they're all going," said Des.
She snatched up the walkie-talkie and tried to raise General Zetter, but all she got was static. Trout tried the sat phone, and it was as dead as it had been all night. "Something really bad's happening," muttered Des. Then the whole building seemed to rumble, and they craned their necks to look up. A phalanx of helicopters flew over, Blackhawks and Apaches. Trout counted 30 of them before the rain obscured his vision. They were not coming to attack the school. They were not headed toward the center of Stebbins. They were all headed northwest, toward Bordentown, toward the edge of the Q zone. "Oh, shit," said Des. Chapter 52. Town of Stebbins, 2 miles inside the Q zone. Boxer turned off the farm roads and drove along the stretch of Mason Street, heading toward the center of Stebbins. According to the GPS, they needed to turn onto Dull Factory Road, and then veer off that to follow a secondary road to the Stebbins Little School. The rain slowed to a desultory drizzle for a few minutes, but the thunder was closer and louder, and the lightning flashed like artillery fire. "What's that?" asked Gypsy, leaning forward from the back seat to point at something on the road ahead. Boxer slowed as they approached a pair of wrecked cars that were little more than burned-out shells. The blacktop around the vehicles was littered with shell casings. Sam Imura rolled down his window to get a better look. A hunting rifle lay on the hood of one car. Beside it, its shape slowly distorting to pulp in the rain, was a box of .30-30 cartridges. A second gun, a military M4, lay sideways across the yellow line down the center of the 2-lane. Near it was a Pittsburgh Pirates ball cap, and a dozen feet away was a blue wool women's sweater. "No bodies," murmured Shortstop. No one commented on that. "Keep going," said Sam, and Boxer gave the wrecks a wide berth. They passed other cars, and once they saw a big 18-wheel Peterbilt that had gone off the highway and smashed its way through the young maples that grew wild beside the road until it crashed itself to silence against a massive old oak. The driver's door stood open, the cab empty. And that was the pattern of it. Wrecked cars and trucks with open doors and broken windows, houses and buildings with doors standing ajar, and miscellaneous debris, but no trace at all of the people of the destroyed little town. No living people. Several times they found bodies sprawled haphazardly on the road, on the verge, on porch steps, in parking lots. Every single one of them showed evidence of traumatic injury to their heads. A few lay with their heads hacked off. "Somebody put up a hell of a fight," said Boxer. "Doesn't look like they won." They reached a deserted gas station and made the turn onto Dull Factory, and stopped before they went 2 blocks. Slowly, all 5 of them got out of the Humvee and stood looking at the monstrous thing before them. A Stryker armored combat vehicle sat at an angle in the middle of the street. It was a brute, 8 feet wide and 22 feet long, sitting on 8 fat tires, with a big Browning .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the top, the same model as the one mounted on the deck of their Humvee. Thousands of empty brass shell casings littered the top of the vehicle, and their curved sides peeked out from puddles. At least 300 bodies clogged the street, many of them civilians, but there were uniforms of local and state police, and even some soldiers. Dead. All dead. Sam had seen the Browning in action, had fired one himself. He could easily, too easily, visualize the moment of slaughter as the living dead shambled into the storm of lead. But what puzzled Sam was how the soldiers lost this fight. The Stryker was abandoned here in the rain, the gun silent. How many of the dead had the guardsmen faced? Had it been overwhelming odds? Had they run out of ammunition?
Or had they been caught in one of those terrifying moments when a gun jams or reloading takes 1 second too long? He would probably never know, but looking at the scene sent a chill up Sam's spine. It felt like the icy breath exhaled against trembling flesh during a moment of precognition. Or perhaps it was an icy touch, not of revelation, but of realization, as he saw, here on this battleground street, what was coming. Soldiers were more than a match for the dead in any kind of fair fight, even 5 to 1, 10 to 1. But there were at very least 7,000 infected in Stebbins, and possibly many more. When a crowd attacks, the front ranks take the bullets so the ranks behind them can advance. Given sufficient numbers, the defenders simply run out of time or ammunition or both, and the wave passes over them. It was something used on battlefields ever since armies went to war. The foot soldiers of Alexander and Napoleon knew it, the riders of Genghis Khan and Santa Anna, and the marching lines of the Romans and the Confederate boys in butternut brown. Cannon fodder, a forlorn hope. Only here, it was no more planned or orchestrated than the thousands of worker ants that die when the entire nest goes to war, or the millions that fall when locusts swarm. In the end, all that matters is that the main host survives. The hive. This was what Sam was seeing. He was positive. This was the real terror of this infection. The parasitic impulse to procreate through infection and to sustain itself through feeding was matched with a ferocious aggression that had no parallel in nature because it was not natural. Volker had made this, building it on the bones of Cold War bioweapons madness. He heard the shallow breathing of the rest of his team, but realized he was holding his own breath. Sam let it out slowly.
"We are so fucked,"
said Moonshiner. No one disputed him. They heard the crunch of glass, and they all wheeled around at the same time, bringing their guns up. Across the street was a diner with a gaping hole where a big picture window should be. The entire frame and all of the building was covered by so many bullet holes that it looked like polka dots, except there was nothing fun or festive here. The rifle-mounted flashlights of the 5 soldiers painted the front of the store in pale yellow light. A figure moved in the gloom just inside the diner.
"Inside the store,"
called Sam.
"United States Special Forces. I need you to step out of the building with your hands raised. If you have a weapon, I need you to drop it now."
The figure came out of the shadows and into the glare of the overlapping flashlight beams. It was a man. He wore only ragged boxer shorts. The rest of his clothes were gone. Much of his flesh was as well. He raised his hands toward the 5 people standing near the Humvee. It tried to moan, but there was not enough of its face left for that. No jaw, no tongue, just a gaping red horror below the stumps of its broken upper teeth.
"I got this,"
said Shortstop, and he fired a single round, the report crisp in the wet air. The zombie's head snapped back, and it fell into the store. But then it seemed to hover there, not quite hitting the ground, and for a bizarre moment, Sam thought that it was somehow fighting for its balance, even though it was bent so far backward. Then the body shuddered and tumbled to one side as something else came into view. Another of the infected. This one was crawling, and its humped body was what kept the first one from hitting the floor. The dead thing's face was smeared with red, and its mouth still worked, still chewed on some piece of something that dangled from between its lips. The creature looked at them and bared its teeth. Sam heard Boxer gag. Not because of the horrible thing on the floor or what it was clearly eating. He gagged because the zombie was dressed in the woodland camouflage of the Pennsylvania National Guard. It was a soldier. Behind it, other shapes moved in the gloom of the diner, and these figures sent up the moan that the first zombie could not, a haunting, wretched cry for something to staunch the dreadful hungers that drove them. They began moving through the shattered window frame. So many of them. So many soldiers among them. Their battle dress uniforms torn, helmets lost or askew, bodies opened by teeth and nails, souls lost, eyes vacant. Black blood dribbled from their mouths.
"Oh, fuck me,"
breathed Boxer.
"Fuck me, fuck me."
"Keep it steady, kid," said Moonshiner. The scuff of a clumsy foot made them turn, and they saw more of the infected coming out of the open doors of the bank, the feed store, the craft shop, and the county assessor's office. 50 at least.
"I thought General Zetter said they had this shit under control,"
growled Gypsy.
"Fuck me,"
said Boxer.
"This is some evil shit right here,"
agreed Moonshiner.
"Stand and fight, boss? Although I'm really okay with hauling ass,"
said Shortstop. But for once, even his pragmatic cool seemed to be crumbling away.
"There's so many of them,"
said Boxer. And as he said it, more of them rounded the corner of the next block. There were children mixed in with the adults, their faces and limbs turned worm white from blood loss, mouths black as bottomless holes. All of them torn, all of them ragged. That's how it stuck in Sam's mind, and somehow he knew that's how it would always be. The ragged people. As if they were all members of some secret fraternity, bound together in death, or from some far country where the sun never shines, and all there will ever be is the hunger.
"Boss,"
urged Gypsy.
"No,"
said Sam, turning.
"Everyone back in the Hummer. This isn't what they sent us to do."
They held their weapons out and ready as they climbed in. The Humvee was armor-plated and had reinforced glass windows, but Sam did not feel even a little safe as he shot the lock on his door. He knew the others didn't either.
"Get us out of here, Boxer,"
he said with a calm he did not feel. But the younger soldier was already putting the car in gear. He backed up and circled the striker, then stamped on the brakes as more of the pale figures moved through the downpour. "Shit!" he said, and spun the wheel.
"This is turning into a crowd scene,"
said Moonshiner. Despite everything he knew about the situation and everything they had done so far this night, Sam hated the idea of opening fire on these ragged people. It felt like abuse to him, like bullying. But there were so damn many of them. The flash drives, he told himself. Get the flash drives, or this is the whole world. All he had to say aloud was, "Shortstop." The man rolled open the top hatch of the Humvee and stood up into the fierce rain. He whipped the cover off the big Browning, yanked the bolt back, and began firing. The heavy bullets tore into a knot of zombies, knocking them backward with massive foot-pounds of impact, bursting apart joints, ripping loose connective tissue, splashing the striker and the other infected with black blood. 4 of the creatures went down. Then another 5.
"Go, go, go!"
yelled Sam, and Boxer hit the gas again. The Humvee rolled over the fallen infected, heavy tires crunching bones. Shortstop pivoted and fired at the zombies closing in on the right. 20 of them.
"Stop Sunday driving!" he bellowed. "Move this fucking thing!"
The Humvee kept rolling forward, but it was difficult to climb over the human debris while avoiding all of the wrecked and abandoned cars. The dead began closing like a fist around the vehicle.
"Little help up here,"
called Shortstop.
"This shit's getting weird." "Windows,"
ordered Sam.
and except for Boxer, the others lowered their windows and stuck gun barrels into the rain. A moment later, the inside of the truck was filled with ear-splitting thunder. Shell casings hit the ceiling and bounced off each other and stung like wasps where they hit bare flesh.
"Shortstop!"
roared Sam.
"Grenade!"
Shortstop stopped firing, plucked a green ball from his rig, and pulled the pin.
"Frag out!"
he cried, as he flung it into the midst of the dead closing on the front of the Humvee. He ducked down a split second before the grenade exploded. Everything in the blast radius was torn to ragged pieces, and at the edges of the blast, the concussion knocked the zombies off balance, leaving a rough opening that was clouded with blood-red mist. Sam punched Boxer on the shoulder.
"Punch it!"
Boxer gave it all the gas it would take, and the Humvee leapt forward, smashing through the crippled dead, crushing others. Behind him, the main mass of the infected closed like the waters of the Red Sea. They collided with one another in their desperate race to get to the living flesh. Gypsy and Moonshiner leaned out of the windows and fired back at them, shooting at legs to shatter thigh bones and drop the pursuers into the path of the rest of them. Shortstop climbed back up and turned the Browning in a circle, not needing to aim. There were targets everywhere. The Humvee shot through the bloody opening, and there was clear street beyond it. Boxer kept his foot on the pedal all the way down to the floor, and with every second the horde of the dead dropped behind. One by one the guns stopped firing, and after a full minute, Sam touched Boxer on the shoulder.
"Okay, kid, ease it down."
Boxer dropped the speed from 70 to 50 to 40 and kept it there. They passed other zombies, but by the time the infected could turn and target them, the Humvee was past. No one fired at them. Everyone sagged back, exhaling balls of burning air, their hands trembling with adrenaline and shock.
"Reload,"
snapped Sam.
"Do it now."
They did it, and the orderliness of that action helped steady each of them. Not completely, but enough so they could reclaim themselves. Enough so they could dare look in each other's eyes. They drove on, no one speaking. There was nothing that needed to be said. Then a soft purring buzz broke the silence, and Sam lunged for his satellite phone.
"Sir,"
he said as soon as the connection was made,
"Stebbins is not under control. There is extreme activity and—"
"Sam, to hell with that," Blair snapped. "The Q zone is compromised. I repeat, the devil is off the chain. The president has ordered the Air Force in. Drop everything else and get to the school. Get those flash drives. Do it now."
"How bad is it?"
Blair paused for a shattered moment.
"It's bad, Sam.
Volker is dead. We're going to have to go big on this and try to stop the spread. But we need those drives. You are authorized to use all means and measures to secure them." Sam felt his throat tighten.
"Understood, sir,"
he said. But the line was already dead. The members of the Boy Scouts exchanged looks. Then Boxer kicked down on the gas. The tires spun on the wet ground until smoke curled up behind the Humvee, and then they were rolling fast, gaining speed, heading toward the Stebbins Little School. Chapter 53. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. The president was surrounded by ghouls. Every face of every person at the table looked like a death mask, pale, devoid of hope, sunken and hollow-eyed. On the screens, the glowing icons that represented the jets were streaking toward Bordentown. Other dots indicated the movement of General Zetter's National Guard forces and the reinforcements that had been ordered in to help hold the quarantine line. With that line broken, the troops were being deployed in a wide circle around the Starbucks. The president took a long drink of water, but it did nothing to soothe his dry, raw throat. He set the glass down with a clunk that seemed absurdly loud in a room that was unusually quiet. "What are our options?" he asked of the people around the table, the people whose job it was to always have answers. General Amistad Burroughs said,
The Jets will— No, interrupted the president. I want to know what we need to do afterward, after the bombs. Sylvia Ruddy shared a look with Scott Blair. She said, You'll have to address the nation again. And say what? Asked the president. Ruddy flinched. No, I want you to tell me, what can I possibly say that will help the country understand this? Sir, the president picked up a sheet of paper and shook it at her, at everyone. Everyone had a copy of the same report in front of them. None of them had touched the report after first reading it. The papers lay on the table, unwanted, feared, despised. These are casualty estimates. In just under 5 minutes, we are going to kill thousands of American citizens. Thousands more are already dead, and we don't yet know if this is the end of it. So, tell me, what exactly is it I'm supposed to tell the nation? The dead faces stared at him and said nothing. Chapter 54. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. The last of the military vehicles rumbled out of the parking lot, leaving behind a scene of disorder and desolation. Now what? Asked Trout. Des nibbled thoughtfully on her lip. If they're really gone— What? He prompted. I can think of only 3 reasons they'd leave, she said, ticking them off on her fingers. It's over, and they've been told to stand down. Is that likely? No. They left too fast and left too much shit behind. They were told to drop and run. Question is whether they're running from or running to. Huh? That's choice 2 and 3. So the second option is that there's another problem. Maybe they found a bunch more of these zombies. Or more likely there's a problem at the quarantine line. What's the third option? She gave him a flat stare. Getting out of the line of fire. For emphasis, she pointed up to the ceiling. Trout followed her finger as if they could both see a jet loaded with fuel air bombs screaming its way across the skies of Stebbins County. Well, Trout said slowly, shit. Yeah. But the flash drives, they want those. They won't blow us up if they think we have them. Sure. Unless they found Dr. Volker. In which case, when this is over, you are going to be one inconvenient motherfucker, Billy. Same goes for me and anyone you may have talked to in here, which is everyone. Even after everything that happened, Trout was aghast at the thought of such cold-blooded murder. He kept shaking his head, but he wasn't sure he actually disagreed. We have a window, Billy, said Des as she turned, hurried to the desk and began shoving the guns and ammunition back into the duffel bag. We need to get the fuck out of here while there's still a here to get out of. What are you doing? Asked Trout. She nodded to the windows. Neither of us believe this is over, right? Not with the way they left. And maybe they're not going to bomb us. But where does that leave us? In a nice, safe building that we're reinforcing, he said, with lots of food and supplies. For a week, Billy. Now think it through. If this is as big a disaster as Zetter said, as big as what Volker told you, then are you telling me that we might only be stuck here for a week? No, but they said they'd airdrop supplies to us. You want me to punch some stupid off of you? He rubbed his chest. No thanks. What am I missing? If the guard had to run out of here like their dicks were on fire, then this thing is spreading, which also means that there are so many of those dead fuckers out there that they had to take everyone, including the cook. Does that sound like anything's under control? No, he admitted sheepishly. No, she agreed. It sounds like big trouble. So, go big picture for a minute. Pull back and look at it. If you're General Zetter and things are going to shit, do you give a crap about, as I said, inconvenient people trapped in a school? Or do you go fight the fight? You go fight the fight. Right. Now, look at it from where we stand. Sure, we have a secure building, and yes, I think we could hold it against 1,000,000 of those things. Exactly. Until we run out of bullets and bread. Until there's no more gas for the generator, no more fresh water, and no more cans of Spam. Tell me, Billy, what happens then? And before you say something stupid like, but they'll come for us by then,
Take a moment and think about how long people waited after Katrina. Weeks in some cases. And that was without a bunch of dead sons of bitches trying to eat everyone. Trout used her words as a lens to stare into the future, and the things he saw were ugly and wrong.
Jesus,
he murmured. We've got our window. No one's watching us, and for the moment, no living dead assholes are trying to bite us. I say we load all our supplies and all of us into those buses. We have more than enough of them. We load up and we get the hell out of Dodge. And go where? She shrugged. Pittsburgh's nice this time of year. So's Harrisburg. So's Philly. Then she paused. Actually, if things are really hitting the fan, there's Sapphire Distributors in Fayette. What's that? Des smiled. A food distribution warehouse. Big-ass brick building. No windows on the ground floor, truck bays where we can back up the buses, its own generator with probably a lot more fuel than we have here, plus enough food to replenish a dozen full supermarkets. We could survive there for months. How do you know about it? Dez's eyes slid away for a moment, and she focused on packing the bag. Des? I, dated a guy who works there, head of security. Who? Do I know him? Maybe. Who, Des? It doesn't matter, damn it. Trout sighed. What makes you think your boyfriend would even let you in? Des colored. Des? He's, still sweet on me. Jesus H. Christ, in a clown car. Des glared at him. Give me a better idea, then. Trout picked up a box of bullets, looked at the label without reading it, and shoved it into the bag. Is anything with you ever simple? He muttered. I mean, ever? Chapter 55. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Patrick Freiwald knew that he was crazy to be out on a motorcycle in the middle of one of the worst storms in Pennsylvania history. Crazy and maybe a little suicidal. The problem was that his car, his nice, warm, dry car, was parked outside of his nice, warm, dry house, way the hell up in the Finger Lakes region, on the far side of Canandaigua Lake. And that was a hell of a lot of miles from here. He'd hit the road after a very good but very long couple of days, bartering and dealing at Monster Madness, a small pop culture convention in Friendsville, Maryland. Patrick had traded some old Aurora Monster model kits, including an absolutely pristine Forgotten Prisoner, for some newer stuff, including the Vampirella, which was a new limited edition based on a Frank Frazetta painting. He'd made enough profit off the Aurora model to stock up on a bunch of lower-end but still cool PVC statues of classic Universal monsters. All of that was in UPS boxes on their way home, and like a lot of the conventioneers, he'd waited out the storm yesterday and hit the road when they said the worst of it was over. The weatherman was dead wrong. Big surprise. He'd barely hit the Pennsylvania state line before the rains started again. Not the sluggish end of the storm showers, but a real downpour. So bad a lot of cars were pulling off the road. Good for them. They could sit there and listen to Howard Stern on Sirius and stay dry. Can't do that on a hog. Outrunning the storm wasn't going to happen. Patrick could tell that much without having to listen to the news. There was lightning so thick and frequent, it looked like a neon forest stretched all the way to the horizon. To every horizon. Going back was for shit, too. His only real option was to motor through until he hit the first town with a cheap motel. With a storm like this, even a roach motel would be good. If it got any heavier, a barn out here in the sticks would be just fine. Patrick wasn't crazy enough to listen to an iPad while driving his bike, but he didn't need the weatherman to tell him there was a storm. Everyone knew about Superstorm Zelda, Sandy's country cousin. As the miles fell away, though, he began wishing he could hear a traffic report. Ahead of him, he could see the double rows of red taillights thickening from a sparse few into tightly packed lines that vanished into the distant rainy darkness. Road speed, already down to 40 because of the rain, was slowing more and more until he was barely making enough headway to balance his bike. "Shit," he muttered, as the line of cars finally ground to a complete stop. Right out in the big dark, smack dab in the middle of nowhere. The last sign he remembered seeing was for a 24-hour Starbucks in some place called Bordentown. He'd never heard of the town, and at that moment didn't give a crap if it was a nice tourist spot or not. A coffee shop open all night was like a gift from God. He roll-walked his Italian motorcycle out of his lane and saw that the shoulder was clear ahead. He gunned the bike and began moving again. The winds tried to knock him sideways into the line of stalled cars, but Patrick leaned forward to cut the resistance and kept moving. He cut quick looks at the people in the cars. Some of them ignored him. Some flipped him off for doing what they hadn't yet dared. The first thing that troubled Patrick was the sudden roar of a helicopter overhead. With the helmet and the roar of the Moto Guzzi's burly engine, he couldn't hear most sounds, but this was a roar, and he risked a look up as a big damn chopper flew right above him. It was huge. One of those bulky military machines with stubby wings laden with what looked like missiles. Missiles? He was so surprised that he almost rear-ended a Civic that cut onto the shoulder right in front of him. The chopper moved slowly above him, heading farther up the road. The rotor wash took the rain and wind and churned them into a fresh and more intense miniature storm. Patrick had to really fight to keep from having those winds knock him down. The second thing that bothered Patrick was how low the chopper was flying. It could not have been more than 100 feet above the tops of the cars. Patrick had never even seen a news helicopter fly that low, especially in winds like this. That's when Patrick saw beams of light sweeping down from the storm clouds. Massive, bright searchlights, intensely bright, but for a moment they did not appear to belong to anything. It was like a scene from that old movie, Close Encounters, and for a brief, irrational moment, Patrick thought that's what he was seeing. UFOs. Aliens. Then the helicopter above him switched on its light, and Patrick understood. The stormy sky was filled with helicopters. No, that wasn't exactly right. The sky was filled with military helicopters. Chapter 56. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Goat Weinman was pretty sure he was dead. So why was he moving? He tried to open his eyes, but either the world was totally without light, or he was blind. Am I dead? He wondered. Panic detonated in his mind as everything Volker had said about the Lucifer pathogen came sweeping back. When a person is infected, the physical body dies, but the mind, the consciousness, lingers, trapped inside hijacked flesh, floating, observing, able to see and feel, connected to every nerve ending, but totally unable to do anything. Trapped. Was that what was happening? Was his body now oh God, he cried out. I'm one of them. Please, God, no, no. Then a voice said, wake the fuck up. That was immediately followed by a hard slap across his face, and Goat felt himself reeling and then slamming into something hard. Metal. He began to fall and thrust his hands out to stop himself. He thrust his hands. He did it. Not some parasitic impulse over which he had no control. Goat grabbed onto what had to be the fender of a car, and he crouched there, sore, his face stinging, terror and doubt screaming at each other in his head. He could feel his hands on the wet metal of the car. He flexed his fingers, and they obeyed. He wasn't dead. He wasn't one of them. Then he felt the wetness on his face. Not the rain. Something heavier, thicker, on his forehead, in his eyes. Suddenly he was pawing at his eyes, and immediately there was faint light. Bad light, but there. He wasn't blind after all. Not blind or dead. There was something in his eyes. He tilted his face to the rain and rubbed at his eyes until he could see. There was something black on his fingers. Until the lightning flashed, and then he saw that his black fingers were red. Slick, glistening red. It was blood. His eyes had been pasted shut with dried blood that was now washing away in the rain. And there, in front of him, crumpled against a tree, was the ruin of a metallic green Nissan Cube. And that's when it all came back to him. Homer. Starbucks. The accident. He turned sharply to see Homer Gibbon standing behind him. The killer stood there in the howling wind and pouring rain, bare-chested, wide-legged, with a monstrous grin of red delight on his face as the lightning burned the sky behind him.
"Don't you go die on me,"
he said with a wicked chuckle.
"Not until I want you to."
Traffic splashed by on both sides of the median, but the cube was almost invisible in the copse of trees into which it had plowed. Goat looked at the car. It was totaled. Smoke curled up from the wheel wells, and one tire had exploded.
"Never liked that faggoty little piece of shit,"
grumbled Homer.
"Now we need to shop for something better."
He pointed a finger at Goat.
"Stay."
He said it the way people do to dogs. Homer chuckled to himself and began walking toward the highway. Goat stayed. Then Goat realized that for some reason the traffic was completely stalled over there. Cars and trucks sat bumper to bumper under the pounding rain. The line stretched all the way to the west, far out of sight. On the other side of the road, there was nothing. He tried to make sense of it, but his head was too sore and none of his thoughts worked the way they should. "You have a concussion," he told himself. But he couldn't remember hitting his head. Could an airbag concuss a person? He thought he should know the answer to that, but couldn't find it in the messy closets of his brain. Homer was almost to the line of stalled cars now. "Run, jackass!" Goat tried to run. He had that much pride, that much clarity of thought left. But when he took his first step toward the opposite side of the highway, his left leg buckled, and he went down hard into the mud. Like an old tape player slowly catching up to speed, Goat's mind replayed the events of the crash. He remembered seeing the tree suddenly filling the view beyond the windshield, and then the windshield itself bursting inward in 10,000 pieces of gummed safety glass. He remembered the white balloon of the airbag and the numb shock as the dashboard seemed to reach in toward his knees, hitting one, missing the other. Then blood and darkness and nothing. He propped himself up on his elbows, spitting bloody water and mud from his mouth. How long had he been unconscious in the car? Long enough for the blood to dry to dense mud in his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, Goat wished that the crash had been a little harder, or that the blocky little cube had been built with less care for the safety of its passengers. It is a weird and dreadful thing to realize that death was far more desirable than being alive. Goat had never suffered through depression, never rode the Prozac and lithium highway, never held a razor next to his wrists and wondered if the pain of the cut was worse than the pain of the next hour or next day. Never looked into the future and saw a world where he was absent. He was in love with life, with living it, with women and sex, with film and the complexities of filmmaking, with the tides and currents of social media, with being him. But now, behind him, he heard Homer calling out to the people in the cars.
"Little help! Little help now!"
Goat thought he heard a car door open. Then a man's voice asked if Homer was hurt, if everyone was okay. And then screams. Such high, shrill, awful screams. Goat closed his eyes and stared into the future and prayed, begged, pleaded for him not to be any part of what was happening or what was to come. Like all of his prayers over the last 24 hours, it went unanswered. And then suddenly, the sky seemed to open, and against all sanity and logic, the morning sun rose in the middle of the night. Goat gaped at the gorgeous, impossibly huge, burning eye of morning. "Oh, my God," he breathed. And despite all of his lifelong agnosticism and cynical disapproval of organized religion, he believed that he beheld the fiery glory of a God revealing himself to his people at the moment of their greatest need. He began to cry. He covered his head with his hands and wept, apologizing for everything he had ever done wrong, promising, swearing, that he would be a better man, that he would hone the grace of this moment. A part of his bruised mind could hear the shrill, hysterical note in his voice, but he didn't care. He was saved. This is what people believed would happen. In the dark night of the soul, at the end of all hope. The night became brighter and brighter, and Goat looked up, truly expecting to see angels with fiery swords, believing it in that moment. A second sun rose above the horizon, and a third. Goat said, "Oh my God," again. It meant something entirely different now. This was not the rising of the sun any more than it was the shield of God's protection to keep harm from his children. They were fireballs rising from over the darkened hills. "What?" Goat asked the fire and the night, and perhaps God. His answer came in the form of a streak of light that arced across the sky and vanished behind the hill. Another ball of fire rose up, veined with red and black, expanding as it fought its way upward against the rain. Goat turned, following the back trail of the streak, and saw something massive and powerful tearing through the sky. "God," he said once more, but it wasn't what he meant. The A-10 Thunderbolt II screamed through the storm above him. Others flew in a wide formation, and they, too, spoke in voices of fire and thunder. Goat's brain, concussed and confused, now understood the difference between heaven come to earth and hell on earth. Chapter 57. Route 653. Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Patrick Freiwald slowed his bike, suddenly unsure of how badly he needed to get to Starbucks and get out of the rain. The sky was filled with dozens of helicopters. Their searchlights cut back and forth to illuminate something on the far side of the hill, 300 yards ahead. And all around the helicopters there were smaller flashes as the beams struck illusionary sparks from the falling rain. As he slowed and the roar of his motorcycle eased down, he could hear sounds from up ahead. The heavy beat of rotors, the blare of horns, and something else. Something staccato and deep. For a moment, Patrick thought it was the bass rhythm of some techno music played at incredible volume, or a drum solo by someone gone totally apeshit. It was neither, and as he slowed to a stop, he heard it much more clearly. And it was at that moment that he realized the flickering lights in the sky were not searchlights reflecting on raindrops. They were muzzle flashes, Above him, there was a sharp hiss, loud as a fire hose, and something streaked over the tops of the cars toward the hill a few thousand yards away. It left a trail of smoke that was quickly torn apart by the rain. Then the whole night turned to day as an immense cloud of yellow and orange light rose up over the hill. The deep-chested boom of an explosion rolled along the blacktop, rocking the cars and knocking Patrick to the side. He nearly crashed his bike, but pushed his weight against it and fought it back upright. And he did that without thought because his mind was numb from what he was seeing. A fireball rose into the air, defying the rains to extinguish it. Patrick said, "Oh, my," but the rest was struck from his mouth as a second explosion sent a competing fireball up into the night, and a third, a fourth. Soon all of the helicopters were firing missiles and rockets and guns. People began getting out of their cars. Despite the rain, despite the insanity of all of this, Patrick could hear them yelling and screaming. There was movement near the top of the hill, and for a moment it looked like roaches boiling out of a sewer drain. Then he realized it was people. Hundreds of people, their clothes dark and shiny with water, running from the helicopter attack, running along the road, moving between the cars, climbing over them, and Patrick stared, not sure of what he was seeing. He raised his visor and peered through the slanting rain. Some of the people seemed to be fighting with each other, wrestling, falling to the ground, bending each other backward over the hoods of cars. "What the fuck?" he said. The tide of violence swept along the row of stalled cars, coming his way, coming fast. He had no idea what was happening. A riot of some kind, people going nuts. Either way, he wanted no part of it. Patrick caught a look across the wide median and for the first time took note that it was empty. And he tried to recall if he had seen a single car come that way since this began. He was sure he hadn't. Not one. What the hell was happening over that hill? The helicopters kept firing. Fireballs raced each other into the air. People were trying to turn their cars, and some of them managed to squeeze out of the press and U-turn on the shoulder. They blared their horns, and there were dozens of fender benders as the panic to escape the moment overcame everything else. Chapter 58. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. A wall of superheated gas came rolling down the highway, flattened wet grass, knocking people down, setting off the car alarms of those stopped vehicles their owners had turned off, bending the trees, turning the rain to steam. It hit Goat as he struggled to his feet and flung himself against the wrecked cube. He hit hard, cracking the back of his head, his elbows, the middle of his back. His skin suddenly felt like it was covered with ants as the heat leached moisture from his flesh. Goat felt hot wind blowing into his screaming mouth and down his throat. He collapsed on his knees, aware on some distant level that new pain exploded in his injured knee, but not immediately able to care. Then, as the fiery shockwave passed, he sagged over into mud that was no longer wet and cold. Goat lay there, flash-burned and stunned, gasping for air in a world that no longer seemed to have any. Then, pulled into the vacuum created by the shockwave, fresh air buffeted him. He dragged in lungfuls of rainy air, sucking it down like a gasping fish returned to the healing waters of the stream. People were screaming. Screaming. Horns blared and Goat heard gunshots, spaced, erratic. Hunting rifles, he thought. A moment later, the air above him was churned to pieces by the beat of helicopter blades, and a split second later, heavier guns opened up. Goat wriggled painfully toward the back of the wrecked car and looked past the rear wheel to see something that made no immediate sense. 5 big military helicopters swayed in the air, their pilots fighting the harsh winds as door gunners fired miniguns at the lines of parked cars. People were running in wild panic between the cars, racing out into the farm fields on the far side of the road, tearing across the median toward the empty westbound lanes. Some had managed to get their cars going and were peeling out of the traffic jam, but most vehicles were too tightly packed. The driver of a Jeep Patriot rammed his vehicle forward, threw it into reverse and rammed backward, and went forward again, crushing bumpers until he had forced open a hole big enough for him to turn off the road. But the car was blind, the headlights smashed, the grille punched in. It limped down the shoulder, but stalled within a dozen yards. And everywhere Goat looked, the panicking people were fighting. Except that wasn't what it was. And after staring for several long moments, he understood what was happening. The firebombing, the attacks on the people in the cars, the violence unfolding before him. He spoke a name. Not Homer's name. He said, "Lucifer." Then headlights burned his eyes as a huge Escalade came tearing through the storm. The SUV slewed to a sideways stop, showering Goat with fresh mud and rainwater. The driver's door swung open and a figure climbed out, huge and powerful, but moving stiffly as if every muscle was cramped. Goat said his name now.
"Homer, the fuck you doing down there, boy?"
laughed the killer. His face and chest glistened with bright, fresh blood.
"Nap time's over. We gots to go."
He jerked open the cube's doors, grabbed Coates' camera bag, laptop, and recorder, put them into the Escalade, then bent and grabbed Goat by the belt and hauled him out of the mud with a huge sucking sound. Homer stood Goat on his feet and gave him a shove toward the passenger door.
"Get in."
He had to shout to be heard over the continuous machine gun fire and all those screams. Goat obeyed and crawled into the SUV. He even buckled up for safety. Homer staggered around and climbed in behind the wheel, grunting with the effort of bending his body. Goat wanted to believe that the killer's stiffness and pain were the result of the accident, but he knew better. "It's rigor mortis," he whispered in his own thoughts, marveling that something as bizarre as that could be the truth. There was a hiss in the air, and then on the road 3 cars flew up into the air on a fireball.
"Rocket,"
said Homer as casually as if he was commenting on a breed of dog walking down the street.
"Let's get some gone between us and that shit."
He put it in drive, and the Escalade lurched forward, wanting to run. But Homer did not race away from the battle. Instead, he killed the headlights and angled toward the trees that filled the 30-yard-wide median. Between explosions and the lightning, there was just enough light to steer, and Homer drove with care.
"Don't want to wreck this ride," said the killer. "Always wanted me an Escalade. Never could afford it."
He paused, thinking.
"Guess the ticket price don't mean shit now."
Goat said nothing. He jammed his good leg against the floor and clutched the dashboard, using his hands to brace himself against unexpected impacts. But the car hit nothing. No trees, anyway. Several times Homer had to swerve to avoid running people, and twice he didn't swerve fast enough. The dull thud of meat and bone against metal was horrifying.
"Slow as shit,"
Homer said, as one man went spinning off the left fender, his body twisting in ways it shouldn't. When the median thinned, Homer angled across the road to where the line of cars was now thinner. He bullied his way through the traffic and went right off the road again into a farm field. With every second, they were leaving the disaster farther behind, escaping. Goat realized that he was watching the single most dangerous man in the world escape. And he was too frightened to do a thing about it. Chapter 59. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Trout heard the sound and thought it was more thunder. He and Des whipped around toward the row of windows that faced the north. They saw the light, and for a moment they thought it was more lightning. Then the whole sky lit up, and something monstrous rose up from behind the forests and rows of houses. A colossus that towered like a fire god from some pagan dream of Ragnarok, a titan of flame who reared above the town and raised a burning sword with such fury that the storm itself recoiled in terror. Des said, "What the—" She got no further as a wall of furnace-hot air blew across the treetops, setting them ablaze, tearing the smaller ones down, shattering thousands of windows, whipping debris into the air and igniting it. The reinforced windows of the school bowed inward, the glass fracturing into tens of thousands of tiny silver lines, but the fragments held fast by the wire mesh. Tongues of flame licked in through those windows that were open, setting fire to curtains and shelves of books and American flags on wooden poles. Trout screamed as he fell backward, steam rising from his clothes. Des screamed too and began slapping at his clothes, swatting out tiny fires that wanted to take hold. The building shuddered as if it was being pummeled by giants. And then it was over, except for the fading echo of a dragon's roar that rolled away from them into the night. The space around the school seemed empty, devoid of air, as if they were suddenly on the surface of the moon. Then, with a banshee shriek, winds whipped out of the east and west with ferocity, attacking the vacuum left by the wave of heat. The winds brought with them the rains. The winds blew long and black. Trout lay on the floor and Des knelt over him, both of them gasping like runners, their eyes wide with terror, their faces flushed with residual heat.
"Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," whispered Des. "What was that?"
But they both knew. In the distance, the fireball still curled upward into the sky, silent now, but all the more frightening for its persistent reality. Chapter 60. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. Patrick Freivold's mind was going into shock, but he felt his body respond to a primal survival drive. Adrenaline slammed into his system, and with a growl he wrestled his bike around, pointing the front wheel toward the verge. He gunned the engine and drove off the road. The verge slanted down, and he sloshed through muddy water so deep it nearly stalled the engine. But Patrick kept it going, doing it right, steering well, keeping control. He picked up speed, kicking up a fantail of mud 40 feet high as he plowed through the rainy field, looping away from the madness and toward the line of cars that had been behind him. He was aware of other vehicles racing through the field, too, and they were all going so fast that he knew the drivers were in full-bore panic mode. That made them dangerous. A motorcycle in the rain was no match for even the smallest compact. So he was forced to steer away from the road and deeper into the field. But it was ink dark out there. His headlight couldn't compete with the storm and rain. Far ahead, at the absolute outside range of his vision, he saw a small side road, a farm road. It was empty. He thanked God and gunned the engine, racing to reach it and get the hell out of there. Patrick never saw the big black Escalade that came bucketing across the field, headlights off, the driver pale and grinning, the passenger paler still, his mouth open in a silent scream. Patrick didn't see any of that. He did, however, feel it, but only for a moment. Chapter 61. Route 653, Bordentown, Pennsylvania. There was a grinding crunch, and suddenly the Escalade slewed sideways, fishtailing in the mud as Homer fought for control. Goat had a fleeting afterimage of a man and a motorcycle flying through the rain, but the SUV kept turning until it spun in a complete circle. As it came out of the turn, Homer gave it enough gas to reclaim the steering, and the machine lurched and bucked, but finally smoothed out. It shot forward across the field.
"Fucking fender's all for shit, goddammit," complained Homer.
We hit, Goat tried to say, but couldn't finish the sentence.
"No, boy, we didn't hit shit. Asshole on the bike hit us. Fuck him."
Goat was trembling so badly that his teeth chattered. Homer cut him a quick look, then laughed. They drove on. Homer kept his speed under 40, and often a lot lower, even when he found a farm road and pulled onto it. The road was lined with huge oaks and elms. Homer lowered his window and squinted up through the falling rain.
"Good," he said. "That's real good."
Goat understood what Homer meant. The helicopters were firing on the cars and on the people fighting between them and fleeing from the road. The infection was out, and they were trying to keep it contained. But a black SUV driving slowly under the eaves of the trees was invisible in the storm, and with every minute they left the sounds of destruction farther behind. Homer kept driving with great care for nearly 10 miles, long past the point where Goat, twisting around in his seat to look, could see the fireballs. All he could hear now was the rain and the wind. Goat licked his lips, tasting mud and blood, and he dared ask a question.
"Where are we going?"
Homer took his time answering. He found a connecting road and turned onto the blacktop. There were other cars there, some heading to the turnoff to Route 653. Goat wanted to yell at them, to warn them, but that was impossible. Eventually, Homer flicked on his headlights as he brought the Escalade up to 55 miles an hour. They crossed the line into Fayette County and found another road that headed north.
"Where are we going?"
Goat asked again. Homer grinned at him with bloody teeth.
"Back to where I was raised," he said.
That confused Goat for a moment. Homer had been born to an addict mother and given up for adoption. He'd been raised in a series of foster homes scattered all over western Pennsylvania. No, he thought suddenly. He's going home, to the place where he became a monster, to the foster home where he was first abused by a sadistic man and his wife, to a small apartment in a big city. "Pittsburgh?" said Goat in a small, frightened voice. Homer shot him a look, then grinned again. It was not a man's smile, maybe not even a zombie's smile. It was the smile of the black eye and the red mouth. It was the smile of a monster. Homer Gibbon drove on through the night.
home again, jiggity jig,"
he sang in a voice that was filled with such dark promise. Chapter 62. The Q Zone, Stebbins County, Pennsylvania. They moved across the quarantine zone, alone and in packs. Some of them wore rags that had once been coveralls and jeans of farmers. Some wore ordinary shopkeepers' clothes. A few wore the blood-smeared battle-dress uniform of the Pennsylvania National Guard. There were whites and blacks, some Latinos, a few Asians. There were adults and children. There were men and women. None of those professional, cultural, racial, or gender identifiers mattered any more. They were all of a kind now.
all of the same species, and they were all unified by a purpose which, though not actually shared, was the same for each of them. Hunger. Age didn't matter anymore. They were all as old as they would ever be. They walked as fast as broken bones and torn tendons would allow them to walk. Some moved with the stick-figure gait of rigor mortis. Others loped along, low and feral and fast. Most of them were leaving Stebbins County. Not that they understood or cared where the county line was. They lacked the capacity for that kind of perception. They left because they could not smell food anymore. It had moved, and so they followed it. But not all of them. Some stayed because they could still smell the fully blooded meat of the living. Those were the ones closest to the town's only high ground, the ones closest to the Stebbins Little School. Chapter 63. The Situation Room, the White House, Washington, D.C. On the big screen, in ultra-high definition and perfect detail, thousands of people died. The thermobaric bombs did terrible work. Someone had the kindness or sanity, or perhaps cowardice, to mute the sound, and so the bombs detonated in ghastly silence. Flashes of light that seemed to halt the storm and repeal the dark rule of night. The President of the United States watched his orders being carried out with the meticulous precision that is only possible at the highest level of military training. Everything was done exactly right. The jets reached their targets with rapidity, they released their payloads with great accuracy, and the weapons performed exactly according to design requirements and mechanical construction. It all happened without a hitch. If the President had been a madman, he would have been able to enjoy such a level of craftsmanship and professionalism. But because he was a sane man, he sat and witnessed and wept. Chapter 64. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. When they could make their trembling legs move, Des and Trout hurried downstairs. The children were screaming in panic. So were most of the adults. Small fires still burned, threatening to take hold on the old building. Des beat and shoved and screamed at the teachers and parents, forcing them from shocked inaction into teams that attacked the flames with water, with fire extinguishers, with jackets they held in their hands and snapped at anything smoldering. 72 people had burns. 18 of them were serious. Mrs. Madison, whose hair was singed and whose eyes had begun to twitch, organized people into emergency care teams. When the first aid supplies ran out, they used Crisco as an unguent. Trout limped along the hallways, searching for children who had panicked and run during the explosion. He opened every door, looked into closets. It was almost the same pattern as when they had looked for the infected. On the ground floor, all the way in the back, he saw a door close as he approached it. He almost called out, but there was something odd about the way it closed. Soft, almost furtive, or perhaps sneaky. He slowed to a cautious walk and moved to the edge of the door, away from the smoked glass panel, not wishing to throw a shadow on it. Inside he heard a sound that at first he couldn't understand or identify. A whispering voice. Male, low, and then snuffles. A child. No, children. Trout pressed his ear to the door to try and hear better. That's when he heard the window. It squeaked and rattled in the frame, and as it did, the sound of rain became louder. Someone inside was opening the window on the ground floor.
Panic flared in his chest, and he grabbed the doorknob and turned it. It only turned halfway and then stopped. Locked.
"Hey!"
Trout yelled, throwing caution away.
"Who's in there? What the hell are you doing?"
He pounded his fist on the door. Inside, a child cried out.
"Open the door, goddammit!"
The cry of the child changed, just like that. It became a scream, and overlaid with it was the low, hungry, unmistakable moan of the living dead. Chapter 65. What the Fink Thinks. WTLK Live Talk Radio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. "We have Teddy on the line," said Gavin. "Welcome aboard the crazy boat, Teddy. Tell the Fink what you think."
"Hey, listen, man. I gotta make this quick."
"Take all the time you need, Teddy."
"No, seriously. I only have a minute. But I needed to get this out. I needed to tell someone what's really going on out here."
"And what is happening out there?"
"This whole thing. All the deaths, the stories about people attacking each other, about people going crazy and killing each other and eating each other. Those aren't stories, man. That's happening. It's happening right now."
"Eating each other, Teddy? It's not funny."
"I'm not laughing," said Gavin.
"But I also don't understand. Who's eating whom?"
"The people who get this thing, this disease, they die, but then they come back right away. So it's not like they're really dead. They get up and start going crazy. You can't talk to them. They don't react the way people do. They're really out of it. All they want to do is eat people."
"And that's what you say is happening in Stebbins County? People running around eating each other?"
"That's definitely what's happening."
"And how do you know this, Teddy?"
"I'm here, man. I'm right here in Stebbins. My whole unit is here, and we're under orders to hunt the infected down and shoot them."
Before Gavin could ask for clarification and verification, the line went dead. The producer grinned through the glass and twirled his finger by his temple. Another loony. Gavin had to agree, but it was loonies that paid the light bill. He punched another button. "We have Samantha from Evans, Pennsylvania. Hi, Samantha. Tell the Fink what you think."
"It's Bigfoot,"
she said. Chapter 66. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Trout tried to kick the door in. He stepped back, raised his knee to his chest, and snapped out with every ounce of strength he possessed. He knew where and how to kick in a door. He'd witnessed cops do it, written about it in news articles, seen it in movies. His heel hit the wood right beside the doorknob. Angle, placement, and leverage should have torn the lock out of its hinges and slammed the door inward. There was only a tiny fragment of time for his brain to process a sudden and awful reality. This door opened out into the hallway. There was absolutely no way to stop that kick. His foot hit, and the door could not, burst inward. Instead, the force of the impact rebounded from the immovable object and shot through his heel, up his shin, and through dozens of muscular transfer points into the nerve clusters in his lower back that were already damaged. He shrieked in pain and instantly fell onto his back on the hardwood floor, the shock knocking the air out of his lungs. Beyond the door, the screams rose to the ultrasonic, burying the sound of hungry moans. Trout was absolutely incapable of movement. Even when he saw the doorknob jiggle and turn, even when he heard the lock click open, even when the door began to swing outward. The edge of the door struck him on the hip, but his sprawled body prevented it from opening beyond a few inches. A small, desperate hand suddenly thrust out through the crack, tiny fingers clawing at the air, trying to grab something, a lifeline, a hope, anything. Then the hall was filled with a dreadful roar of rage and horror. Billy turned his dazed head and saw a demon running out of the shadows toward him. Beautiful and terrible, blue eyes blazing like lasers, teeth bared in an animal snarl. "Des!" he croaked. She leapt over him, and as she landed, she planted a foot against his hip and shoved him away with ruthless force. He rolled over, fresh agony spearing through him. Des tore open the door, grabbed the child, a little black girl with cornrowed hair decorated with pink dragonfly clips, and hauled her out of the room. The child came staggering into the hall, covered in blood, trailing blood, streaming blood. The sound that came from Des Fox was more savage and far less human than anything Trout had heard from the mouths of the infected. It wasn't a sane sound. It was bestial and horrible. She whipped the door all the way open and ran into the room, and through that open door, Trout could see the tableau and understand what had happened. One of the adults had tried to escape through a window, taking several children with him. But the dead had been outside. Without the soldiers to surround the school, the dead had come hunting for food. 3 of them were already inside the room. More of them milled beyond the open window. All of them were blackened and burned, their skin cracked from the heat, their hair burned away, their clothes still smoking. The only color Trout could see was the white of their teeth, the milkiness of their dead eyes, and the red blood on the mouths of the zombies inside the school. Trout saw all of this in a terrible flash. Then the storm outside seemed to enter the school as thunder and lightning tore the room apart. Des had her gun out and she fired. Fired! The booms of the Glock seemed impossibly loud. The muzzle flashes strobed images into Trout's memory, a blackened face flying apart as hollow-point rounds exploded its skull. Then Des was moving, shoving her way past children who cringed back, hands clamped to bleeding wounds, voices raised in desperate pleas that Trout knew could never be answered. Not anymore. 2 of the burned infected were down, and the 3rd lunged at Des from her blind side. "Watch!" cried Trout. But Des was already turning, firing, blowing the hungry need from the eyes of the dead thing. She raced to the window, gun out in front of her in 2 hands, and emptied the rest of the magazine into the faces of the things that were fighting each other to climb inside. They fell backward. Des swapped out the magazine, letting the empty one fall. She leaned out and began firing again, screaming at them to fall, to die, to fucking die. And they died. Feet pounded down the hallway, and Trout turned to see a knot of adults racing toward him, guns and clubs in their hands. He saw them reach for the children, and even though he hated himself for doing it, even though he knew it would earn him a sentence in hell, he yelled them back. "They're bitten!" he bellowed. "They're infected!" The adults stumbled to a halt, their fear and uncertainty warring with their basic humanity. The little black girl with the pink clips had fallen down, and she lay still and unmoving on the floor 5 feet away from Trout. Her wounds no longer bled, and as he stared, the blood around the bite marks changed. At first, the bright red seemed to fade to a paler pink, but that was an illusion created as thousands of tiny white worms seemed to explode within the mess. The process was so damned fast that it was like watching a movie speeded up. First, there were dots of white, and then they expanded before his eyes before finally bursting open as worms. Then, within seconds, those newborn worms began seeding the blood with new eggs, which swelled and burst, continuing a cycle that seemed impossible. Except that it was going on, right there, right in front of his eyes. Volker's monster at work. The worms excreted an oily black substance whose nature Trout could not even guess, and soon the blood became as black as motor oil, totally polluted, totally corrupted. Then the little girl's eyes opened. She and Trout lay 5 feet apart, a child and a man, both of them trapped inside a nightmare. Chapter 67. Town of Stebbins, 1 mile inside the Q-zone. Back in the Humvee, Sam took the radio booster unit, removed a small cable, and plugged it into his cell phone. "I thought everything was jammed," said Boxer. "Special line," explained Sam. "For emergencies. Have to keep the conversation short, though, because it's not all that secure." Sam punched a number and was not surprised when it was answered halfway through the first ring. "Are you inside?" asked Scott Blair. The connection was very bad, but workable. "Affirmative," said Sam. "And I have 2 things to report. First, there are definitely Z's at large within the area. Does that match your latest intel?" Boxer mouthed the word Z's. Blair said, "On-site command reports that the last Z's are being dealt with." "That sounds like the bullshit it is, sir," observed Sam. "We found 3 without even looking. That tells me there are more, and probably a lot more. Between terrain and the storm, no ground search can make reliable claims." "For what it's worth, even SZ agrees," said Blair, careful not to name General Zetter over an open line. "He has requested 10,000 additional units be shipped to his warehouse, ETA 2 hours. 10,000 new troops. Sam whistled. "Not soon enough," he said. "And that brings me to the second thing. The checkpoint we passed was manned by a couple of kids who couldn't keep anyone out of anywhere. SZ's using 2-man teams on the roads, and the roving patrols between checkpoints are a joke. They couldn't keep kids out of a candy store. If the whole area hasn't already been breached, then it's a matter of time." Blair cursed. "Listen to me," said Sam. "I don't know or care what you have to do to convince the big man that the current response is inadequate. Seems to me that everyone is proceeding like this thing is over, but it's not going to take much for this thing to go into the shitter. If it helps any, put me on the phone to the president." "It's worth a try," said Blair. "But I now have something to tell you. HV is dead." It took Sam a second. HV. Dr. Herman Volker. Oh, shit. Tell me he at least left the accounts. He leaned on the word. "That is negative. 0 accounts." Sam watched lightning fork in the sky. "Where does that leave us?" "With a mission change," said Blair. "I need you to scrap the science trip and proceed to the secondary source. It's all riding on that. Do whatever you have to do." The line went dead, and Sam put the phone away. He told the others what Blair had said and explained that the secondary source of Volker's information was in the possession of Billy Trout. "Which means we have to infiltrate a school full of scared kids and force this Trout guy to pony up the flash drives?" asked Boxer. "In a nutshell." No one looked happy. "I volunteered for this gig, boss," said Boxer. "But I didn't sign on to kill civilians, and I sure as shit won't cut my way through a bunch of kids." Sammy Mura said nothing. Around them, the storm slapped against the windows of the Humvee, and the night seemed to go several shades darker. Gypsy very quietly said, "If this thing gets out of the Q-zone, it's game over for the whole world. That's not trash talk, Boxer. That's not a bad line from a monster movie. That's real shit, and it's what we're here to stop. I don't want to hurt anyone but bad guys either. But if it's a few civilians versus the rest of the fucking world, I mean, come on. Is that even a discussion?" No one answered that. Not even Boxer. "Come on," said Sam. "Let's go hunting." Chapter 68. Stebbins Little School, Stebbins, Pennsylvania. Des Fox knew she was losing it. Or maybe she had already lost it. She knew that as certainly as she knew that she should absolutely not, climb out of the window of the Stebbins Little School. All she had to do was close the window. Close it, lock it, then close and lock the door to that room. That was all. Something simple. A smart and very sane choice. which she did not make. Instead, she hooked a leg over the sill, shifted her buttocks onto the ledge, ducked her head out of the dry room and into the rain. Hands reached out of the storm to claw at her, fingers that were withered to black claws by heat. Soot-stained teeth clacked together as the dead came for her. Behind her, Billy Trout was screaming her name. "Fuck you," she growled. Des was never sure if she meant that for Billy or for the dead. It didn't matter. Her mind was filled with the immediate images of those children, her children, the little ones under her protection, bitten, infected, doomed. She jammed the barrel of the Glock against a charred forehead and fired. Did it again to another infected. 2 of the dead fell back, their suddenly limp bodies collapsing against the other zombies, hampering them, tangling up with them. Des jumped down, using the pistol to smash aside the reaching hands. She kicked at wobbly legs, shattering bones, causing jagged splinters of white to rip through the blackened skin. She fired and fired. Every shot was point blank. Every bullet hit a face, a forehead, a temple. Every hollow point round did what it was manufactured to do. It expanded and exploded through the brain matter, blowing out the backs of skulls, spattering the other dead with pieces of bone and brain. More than once the bullets, fired from so close, punched through one skull and then struck another. She fired every round in the magazine, released it, let it fall, swept another magazine from her belt, slapped it into place. The process was absolutely automatic, as orderly and efficient as the functions of a machine, a robot. The dead kept coming out of the rain. 10 of them. 15. 30. The gun was heavy in her hands, the recoil sending jolts of pain into her palms and wrists, her trigger finger burning with overuse, her skin tingling with powder burns. When she had come leaping out of the window, Des had been screaming, a primal war cry, something like a cave woman might have bellowed as predatory animals stalked toward her own mewling children in the dark of a prehistoric night. But as she fired and fired, the scream burned away, leaving only the rasp of her panting breath and the thunder of her gun. She could feel her face lose expression. It wasn't a calmness settling in her muscles. It was a deadness, a nothingness. The dead wore no expressions either, and the battle became strangely dreamlike. Des dropped an empty magazine and fished for her last one, and did not find it. Suddenly, the deadness was gone. Panic returned in a terrible rush as she realized that she had miscounted the number of magazines she had carried, that she had used every last bullet. There were at least a dozen of the dead still on their feet, and 4 or 5 more crawling along, trailing broken legs behind them. She turned toward the school and with a cry of horror realized that somehow she had moved away from it, that she had walked into the schoolyard, leaving the building 50 yards behind her. She was trapped out in the storm, surrounded by the dead, and there was not even a bullet left to take her own life. The dead closed around her. Chapter 69. Stebbins Fayette County line, east of the Bordentown Starbucks. Ross Cruikshank staggered away from his burning car and ran for the woods. Steam rose from his clothes, and he could feel a dangerous heat spreading on his skin. His mind was filled with mad images that were fractured and strange. Pale-faced people with black mouths, blood-splattered people reeling out of the storm and throwing themselves at the crowd that stood watching in numb horror as helicopters fired on the lines of stopped cars. And then something else. A screech from above the dark clouds, streaks of bright yellow light, and then fire. Fire! Everywhere! Cars leapt into the air and exploded. People ran screaming, their hair and clothes ablaze. People flying apart, each separate piece of them igniting as the heat blooms spread out from the point of impact. The shimmering wave of hot air moved across the road like an attacking mirage, surreal and deadly. Ross was at the extreme edge of the blast zone. His car was more than 2 miles back from the Starbucks on Route 653, and until the blast, he stood on the edge of the median, hands cupped around his eyes so he could see through the rain as he tried to make sense of what looked like a soccer riot there on a rural highway in Pennsylvania. The radio had been weird all night, with local news talking about virus outbreaks and rumors of people being killed in Stebbins. Ross had never heard of Stebbins, beyond it being a place on the map between his long drive from an uncle's funeral in Akron to a friend's wedding in Cape May, New Jersey. He had taken the back roads because the news said that the Pennsylvania Turnpike was slowed to a crawl, even this late, because of the storm and because of whatever the hell was happening in wherever the hell Stebbins was. Then he hit the traffic jam on Route 653, totally blocked in, sitting there for 40 minutes before finally getting out of the car to see what he could see. What he saw was the riot, or whatever it was. Then the helicopters. That made no sense to Ross. Then the jets and the flashes of bright light. And now he ran through the rain, with steam hissing from his clothes and a mouth filled with hot ash and gritty debris. He coughed and gagged as he ran. He fell several times, dropping knees first onto the highway, then falling off the asphalt into the rainwater that surged through the brimming runoff ditch. Falling into the cold water was like plunging into a river of knives. Ross screamed hoarsely, his burned throat seemingly filled with razor blades. He scrambled up the other side and struggled weakly to his feet, just as a second streak of fiery light arced out of the clouds and struck the line of stalled cars. Then Ross felt himself flying. Flying. He soared through the storm winds, wondering if this was real or a dream. Ross did not remember landing. His next conscious perception was pain and sickness. He lay in the dark, legs and arms splayed, face turned to the sky as water filled his mouth. He coughed, swallowed too much water, and then rolled to his side and vomited. The insides of his mouth ached from the superheated air he had inhaled, and there was a burning line of scalded tissue running along the wall into his lungs and down into his stomach. It hurt, and it itched. He coughed again and spat something bitter and foul into the mud. Ross pawed at the dribble on his lips, and he thought, just for a strange little moment, that he could feel something wriggle between his fingertips. Something tiny. But the rain washed it away. The itching in his throat continued. Sickness sloshed like sewer water in his stomach. He vomited again and again, unsure of whether anything was coming up. It was too dark to see, and his throat hurt too much to tell. The darkness took him again. When he was next aware of things, he was on his feet, walking. It wasn't the median anymore, nor was it farmlands. When the lightning flashed, it painted vertical lines all around him. Tree trunks. He was in the woods. Ross did not know which woods. At night, in the dark, he hadn't seen much of the landscape. This was rural Pennsylvania, though, and it was a green state. Lots of damn forests. He knew on some level that he was in shock and that he was hurt, maybe badly hurt, but he didn't seem able to care about it. He did care about the sickness, though. His stomach felt like it was full of wriggling snakes, and his entire esophagus itched terribly. His skin did too. He scratched his arms and chest, but it didn't help. The itch was under the skin, deep and painful.
I gotta get home,
he thought. And while he understood what that meant, it felt somehow irrational and stupid. Home was hundreds of miles away from here, and he didn't even have a car. Why didn't he have a car? He wondered. But he couldn't answer that question. It was so hard to think clearly. The ground began to slant downward, and he followed it because it was so much easier than climbing uphill. He staggered along, going in and out of awareness. Then his foot caught on an exposed root, and Ross was falling. He felt himself hit the ground, chest first, the shock driving the air out of his lungs, and then, as he fell face forward into the mud, there was a sharp metallic snap and a white-hot explosion of pain on both sides of his face. He could feel something like knives punching in through his jaw and cheeks and temples. Broken bits of teeth filled his mouth, and he tried to spit them out so he could scream. But he could not scream. Not the way he wanted to. Not the way he needed to. The teeth held his jaws shut, locked, trapped. Ross Cruikshank lay there in the dark, with a heavy-grade steel bear trap locked around his face, the teeth buried deep, a chain anchoring it to the trunk of a tree. It took nearly an hour for him to die from blood loss, shock, and burns. It took less than a minute for him to come back. But all through that night, and for all the nights and days to follow, Ross lay face down in the forest, caught in the jaws of the trap, chained to the tree, unable to rise, unable to hunt, unable to do anything about the awful, gnawing hunger. All he could do was lay there and moan and rot. East of the Bordentown Starbucks. Deborah Varus drove like hell. All hell itself seemed to follow. Mushroom clouds of burning gas billowed into the air, and the trees along both sides of the road burned like candles. Her husband, Roger, was a silent, twitching hulk in the seat next to her. She tried not to look at him, tried not to smell the cooked meat stink of him. He had stood between her and the first blast of superheated air. She would remember how it looked as he seemed to rise into the air, arms out to his side as if crucified against the night, and then flew back against her, and they both went tumbling and crashing into the watery mud beside the road. It was the mud that saved them. Of that Deborah had no doubt. If they were, in fact, safe. It had been a screaming hell to pull him out of the mud and to support him as they staggered toward their car. The doors were still open from when they had gotten out to see what was wrong, and Deborah pushed him in. She didn't dare pull the seatbelt around him. Too much of him looked blistered. Instead, she limped around to the driver's side, got in, slammed her door, cut the wheel, and tore off another car's bumper as she broke out of the line of stopped cars. She hit the gas hard to give the car enough momentum to fly across the drainage ditch. Even then, the rear wheels hit the lip, and for a moment, Deborah thought the car would slide backward into the water. But the muscular front wheels somehow found purchase in the mud, and the car lurched forward onto the median. She cut across, weaving around staggering survivors who were all trying to flee the blast, and then she hit the opposite lane, fishtailed around, straightened, and bore down to the west. The speedometer climbed to 60, and then 80, and after that, she stopped looking. Deborah had no idea what had happened. The stalled cars, and then something that looked like a riot, but it was a half a mile from where she and Roger stood. It looked, though, as if whatever the commotion was, it was coming their way, but then the world seemed to explode. She wondered about that, and whether she should be far more upset than she was. Shock. It was shock. I'm in shock. It was a strange thought to have, like realizing you're drunk. You know it, but can't really take control of body or mouth or anything. Like being a passenger in a hijacked car. I'm in shock.